turn your videos on and let's get into place for the meeting. And Mr. Teefank, I assume I can be heard. Is that correct? Thumbs up? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And if you could check in with Mr. Soboroff, Commissioner Soboroff, just to ensure he's currently available, since we'll be getting started shortly. Members of the public, if you joined us, we're waiting to have all members of the commission signed on. There we go. Let's just give one moment here. There we go. Mr. Soboroff, can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Mr. Soboroff, Commissioner Soboroff, can you hear me? Commissioner Bonner, can you hear me? Okay. Commissioner Soboroff, sir? Can you hear me, sir? Thumbs up, sir? So I know we should get started. Mr. Teefank, are you aware, should we take a quick recess to allow the tech folks to assist Mr. Soboroff?
I've just asked him to turn his volume on, ma'am. Should be just a moment.
Okay, thank you. There we go, Mr. Soboroff. Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes.
Okay, very good. We need to have your camera back on, sir.
Oh, boy.
There we go. Very good. Good morning. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. This is the special meeting of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll, and commissioners, please unmute your microphones to do a verbal roll call, please.
Good morning. Commissioner Decker.
Here.
Commissioner Goldsmith, not present. Commissioner Bonner.
Here.
Commissioner Figueroa Villa, not present. Commissioner Soboroff.
Here.
Thank you. And also present are Chief Moore, City Attorney, and the Inspector General, and we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Very well. welcome everyone. I'd like to begin today's meeting again by expressing our gratitude and admiration to all essential workers for their exceptional service to the Los Angeles area. Mr. T. Pank, because we only have three people, three commissioners today, I request your assistance in ensuring that all three of us are connected at all times. I may not recognize if we've lost a connection with any of the commissioners, and I want to be sure we have a quorum at all times. I appreciate your.
Yes, ma'am. And commissioners, if you have to step away for a moment, if you would just say so, because if we lose a quorum, so let us know. We'll just take a brief pause. We have to step away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And if we could all go, if you're not speaking, let's go on mute so that we can not get background noise. Today's regular agenda consists of a presentation, a continuation or follow-up to last week's report on the 2019 use of force report. Then we have a grant application, what I believe is the final adjustment of fees the commission's required to present at the end of every fiscal year, and 2 donation items. That's the regular agenda. Then we move on to the chief's report, public comment, and 2 closed session items. That's the overview of today's agenda, which can be downloaded from our website. We'll begin with that agenda in just a moment, but just as a reminder to all members of the public, you can participate in this meeting in a number of ways. They're all outlined on the front of the agenda. But to summarize, you can call in and listen to this meeting, but you cannot participate in the public comment portion, or you can submit written public comments to the email address policecommission@lapd.online. And we do have some written comments for this week's meeting and for the agenda items. Thank you to all of you who chose to do that. You can also participate in this meeting by logging in, as many of you have undoubtedly done today. And participate on your computers, laptops, phone devices, or you can call into this Zoom meeting. And when you wish to speak, press *9 if you wish to speak on an agenda item. As we proceed through the agenda, I will announce the specific item we are addressing. You should also be able to see it on your screen. The queue for public comment opens once the agenda item is called and not before. It will close at the conclusion of the discussion or questions on that item. And I will state that public comment is closed. If you do not express your interest in speaking before comment period is closed, you will not be called upon. There will be no late submission of requests to speak or the equivalent of cards in our live meeting. When it comes to the chief's report, which is followed closely by general public comment, when I'm advised the last speaker has been called up on the chief's report, I'll open public comment on the next agenda item, which is general public comment. That way people have time to raise their virtual hands or get in queue without delaying the meeting. So with that background, let's move to the agenda. And if there's anybody in queue, please clear the queue for public comment, and we will now open regular agenda item 1A, the department's verbal presentation and discussion relative to the 2019 use of force year-end report. And I see Chief Grimala has joined us, and as I understand, she will again be making this week's presentation. Is that correct, Chief Grimala?
Yes, Commissioner Decker, it is.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Last week, a contextual picture was presented for today's deeper examination of uses of force in 2019. Today's focus will be on the 53 categorical use of force incidents, with particular emphasis on the 26 officer-involved shooting incidents. And in addition, the 2,320 non-categorical uses of force involving non-lethal and lethal force options will be discussed. We will also be looking at trends, comparing data to 2018, and also reference with brief historical comparisons to the years 2015 through 2019. We will conclude the presentation with a look at department training in the areas of use of force, de-escalation, command and control, and contact with those suffering with mental illness. I'd like to begin with a brief overview of significant points from the 2019 evaluation and report. There was a decrease in officer-involved shootings in 2019, the lowest number in the last 30 years. Operations Valley Bureau had the most significant decrease in 2019 of officer-involved shootings. 8% of Metropolitan Division officers were involved in officer-involved shooting incidents in 2019 compared to 2018. This was a decrease of 3 percentage points. In 2019, Metropolitan Division officers had a percentage point decrease of OIS incidents compared to the aggregate percentage, 13%, that we saw from 2015 through 2018. There's also a decrease in officer-involved shooting incidents involving officers with between 11 and 20 years on the job. And this is a decrease of 12%. There was also a decrease in officers injured in officer-involved shooting incidents by 44% compared to 2018, and 61% below the 4-year average. Very importantly, there was a decrease in non-fatal injuries to suspects involved in officer-involved shooting incidents in 2019 when we did the comparison with 2018, and that was approximately 38%. Very importantly as well, we saw a decrease in custody deaths by 57%, and also a decrease in law enforcement related injury categorical uses of force, also known as LERIs, by 33%. There was a decrease in categorical uses of force involving those perceived to be suffering from mental illness. There was also a decrease of 21% compared to 2018 in all officer-involved shooting incidents where the suspect was perceived to be suffering from mental illness. Also an 11% decrease from the 4-year average. And there was also a decrease in the usage of the police rifle by 8 percentage points compared to the 4-year average from 2015 to 2018. An overview of the 53 categorical use of force incidents in 2019 is what you're taking a look at right now on the screen. Today's discussion will be focusing on the 26 officer-involved shootings, 21 during which a suspect was struck by gunfire. Also notable, in 27% or 7 of the 26 officer-involved shooting incidents, the suspect involved fired at officers prior to the officers becoming involved in a shooting. For context, as we look at the whole categorical use of force picture, so this would include officer-involved shootings, law enforcement-related injuries, head strikes, canine contacts, and in-custody deaths. We wanted to give an overview to you, the commissioners, as well as members of the public, to see what the source of activity that caused the officers to be engaged in those incidents looks like. And radio calls, as you could see, tops the list. So now as we begin our categorical use of force discussion, the major focus today will be on officer-involved shooting incidents. And the definition of an officer-involved shooting incident is an incident in which a department employee intentionally discharges a firearm. This includes warning shots, animal shootings, tactical intentional discharge incidents. And these are characterized into the hit and no hit occurrences. So the slide you're looking at now discusses officer-involved shootings looking at our 4 geographic bureaus. So 12 of the 26 total officer-involved shootings in 2019, which equates to about 46%, occurred in Operations Central Bureau. And this was the only one of the 4 bureaus that we saw had an increase over 2018. So the increase for Operations Central Bureau from 2018 to 2019 was 5 incidents, or 71%. As we look at Operations South Bureau, 7 of the 26 officer-involved shootings, or 27%, occurred in South Bureau. And this was notably a decrease of 4 incidents, or 36% compared to 2018. As we look now at West Bureau, they had 2 of the 26 incidents, or 8%, and they also showed a decrease from 2018 of 1 incident. Looking at Valley Bureau, they had 3 of the 26 incidents, which equates to approximately 12%, and it was a decrease in totality of 9 incidents, or 75% of a reduction from 2018. Now we turn to looking specifically at officer-involved shootings and the source of activity which brought officers into the interactions with the suspects. So 11 of the 26 officer-involved shootings, or 42%, originated from radio calls for service dispatched via communications division. Historically, though, radio calls still represented the largest source category of officer-involved shootings, and this is going back to 2015 as well. 6 of the 26 officer-involved shootings, or 23%, originated from field detentions that were based on officer observations, and this would include things such as pedestrian and traffic stops. Looking at 3 out of the 26, or 12%, originated from off-duty incidents. As we look now at the annual average of rounds fired per incident, and we're also going to begin by looking at the total number of rounds fired by officer per their weapon type. So in totality, the total number of rounds fired by officers in 2019 was 263. Looking at weapons type, handguns represented 233, shotgun rounds 5, and rifle 25. And we took a close look at the police rifle, its usage in overall officer-involved shooting incidents. And we take a close look because it is a very unique weapon. It is one that takes extra training and responsibility. And that has been an emphasis by the chief of police and our training cadre. So we were glad to see that lower double-digit use of the rifle. With regard to the annual average of rounds fired per incident in 2019, it was approximately 10.1 rounds. The 2018 average, was 7.5 rounds. And compared to 2015 through 2018, the average annual number of rounds was 7.5. So we saw an increase in 2019 of approximately 35%. Looking at officer weapon types, in these 26 OIS incidents, 40 out of the 47 officers who were involved in the 26 OISs were using handguns at the time, and that's 85%. That's actually a 3% decrease compared to 88% in 2018. Looking also at the total of number of rounds fired by officers, we already covered that, and that was 263. That was a slight increase of 15 rounds, or 6%, over 2018, which was at the number 248. However, 2019 represented the 3rd lowest number of rounds fired by officers in officer-involved shootings in the last 5 years. Now we turn to the number of rounds fired per incident by officers, and we'll go through this briefly. In half of all officer-involved shootings, 1 to 5 rounds were fired. And that was 50%, so 13 out of the 26. The next following number was 6 to 10 rounds, or 19%, which covered 5 of the 26 officer-involved shootings. Right now, we'd like to take a look at suspect information on all officer-involved shootings in 2019. Suspect gender in 25 out of the 26 cases, or 96%, were males involved in officer-involved shootings as far as suspects. And that was a 4% decrease from 100% of males involved in 2018. The suspect age, the largest group was 10 out of the 26 officer-involved shootings, which were representing 38% of individuals that were aged 30 to 39. We'd like to turn now to look at officer-involved shootings with suspects perceived to have mental illness. So of significance is the decrease in 2019 of officer-involved shootings involving suspects with perceived mental illness. We had 4 out of the 26, or 15%, in 2019. This signifies a 21% decrease compared to 36% of those with perceived mental illness engaged in an officer-involved shooting in 2018. As we look historically back to 2015 to 2018 numbers, then 26% of individuals were involved in officer-involved shootings who were perceived to suffer from mental illness. So in 2019, we experienced an 11% decrease from that historical time frame. I think it's important now, as we look at this very important data point, to talk about why this may have occurred. And I think it's very important to point out, and we'll discuss later, department training, but also the revision of dispatch policy through communications division, which ensured that a supervisor and additional unit were dispatched on all radio calls for service in which information could be gleaned that the person involved as a possible suspect was experiencing either a mental health crisis or mental illness in some form. And the whole purpose of having that added to the dispatch policy was to ensure that there was better de-escalation, the buying of time and distance, and supervisory control over officer actions. So I just wanted to add that to your review and to that picture. In addition now, I'd like to talk about homeless suspects. So as we talk about officer-involved shootings, 6 out of the 26 suspects, or 23%, who were involved in officer-involved shootings were perceived to be homeless. And this accounted for a 12% increase compared to 11% of suspects who were perceived to be homeless in 2018. The statistics we have take us back to 2016 numbers for the most part with accuracy. And that was because in 2016, the Board of Police Commissioners mandated the department to start tabulating and chronicling such incidents with due notation to the fact if the individual was homeless. So that's why when you look at the data information here on the screen, you see an NA designated under 2015. Briefly, we'd like to take a look at deceased suspect toxicology results. The numbers you see for 2019 are still pending. The last numbers we have are for 2018. And that is because that information comes through us through the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, and they were not yet available. So we just want to talk about trends here. And so we'll look back, not at 2019, but we'll go back an additional year to 2018, where 14 decedents in 2018 from officer-involved shootings, 12 of whom, or 86%, did test for alcohol or controlled substances. And that was an increase in 2018 from 2017 of 4%. So we are monitoring and awaiting the results for 2019 to see if we have any public health concerns that also could translate into training and identification of significant issues to incorporate in training for officers in those situations. Right now, we'd like to look at suspect information with regard to suspects' weapons or forced use in all of the officer-involved shootings in 2019. In 17 of the 26 cases, or 65%, the most utilized weapon was a firearm. 2019 experienced a 12% increase over the 4-year aggregate going back to 2015. So in totality, as you take a look at weapons types, firearms and edged weapons showed an overall increase in those with which a suspect was armed. In the case of edged weapons, 5 of the 26 officer-involved shootings involved a suspect who had an edged weapon, and that was approximately 19%, and that denotes a 2% increase over 2018. There are no situations, as you can see from these data points, where a replica or pellet gun was an issue. With regard to physical force, 2 out of the 26, the suspect utilized physical force, which resulted in an officer-involved shooting. This is a slight increase of 2% over 2018. And in one situation, an impact device was used by the suspect, and this was a 1% increase over 2018. There were also no perception-based shootings amongst the 26 officer-involved shootings in 2019. We'd like to take a look now at suspect, let me emphasize that, suspect injuries in the officer-involved shootings of 2019. So out of the 26, 12 suspects died from police gunfire, and this is approximately 46%. This number did not change and was consistent with the facts and numbers we have from 2018. When compared to the 2015 through 2018 annual average of 17.5 deceased suspects, 31% below was where we find ourselves in 2019 compared to the 4-year annual average. Looking at non-fatal injuries, 10 out of the 26, or 38% of the injuries by gunfire to a suspect were non-fatal. This was a 38% reduction from 2018, or 16 suspects that were non-fatally injured over last year. "85% of the 26 officer-involved shootings included a fatal or a non-fatal gunshot wound of some kind. In 3 instances, suspects were uninjured." We'd like to turn now to a look at department personnel and their ethnicity compared to the city population. We thought this was important in the greater context of the conversation to see not only how the Los Angeles Police Department is trying to hire to diversity and parity to be reflective of the communities it served, but also for the overall context of this conversation for the commission and concerns of the public. So I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at this. And as you can see, when you look at the city population and department personnel, there is a fairly stable and good correlation between those percentages and numbers. Now we'd like to look at officer information in the context of the 26 officer-involved shootings. So in 2019, 47 department personnel were involved in 26 incidents. All of the officers involved were male. This is an 8% increase over 2018, where it was 92%. Historically, from 2015 to 2019, female officers accounted for 18 out of 322 officer-involved shootings, or 5%. Looking at officers' ethnicity on the slide you're looking at right now, 26 of the 47 department employees were Hispanic, or 55%. And this is a 1% increase over 2018. 14 of the 47 officers were white, or 30%. 4 out of the 47 officers involved in an officer-involved shooting were African American. And 3 employees, or 6%, were Asian Pacific Islanders or Filipino. 15 out of the 26 officers were Hispanic, or 58%, a slight increase over 2018 of 5%. 8 out of the 26 African American suspects, excuse me, wrong slide. Okay, now we're talking about suspects. I'm sorry. Okay, so now we're turning to the suspect ethnicity information. So 15 out of the 26 suspects involved in an officer-involved shooting in 2019 were Hispanic, and that's 58%. 8 out of the 26 African-American suspects were involved in officer-involved shootings, and this was 31%. And this was a 0% change compared to 2018. 2 of the suspects involved in the 26 officer-involved shootings were white, and this equates to approximately 8%. And this was a 2% increase over 2018. Looking now at ethnicity of deceased suspects, of the 12 deceased suspects involved in officer-involved shooting incidents in 2019, 8 or 67 were Hispanic. 2 or 17% were African American. And 1 out of the 12 suspects was white. 1 represented an other ethnicity, and this would be a category of mixed race, or someone, for example, from Guam, or one of the denoted ethnicities that is not considered in these standard categorizations. Moving on now to a brief overview of adjudications and how officer-involved shootings are adjudicated. I know the chief will be providing the commission with information on where we are in 2019 adjudications, which we're still going through now. We're about at the halfway point, even though we're in 2020. And this is because the review process for officer-involved shootings is quite lengthy and takes somewhere between 8 and 10 months to evaluate. So when we look at 2019 cases, I'm going to defer to the chief there. In 2018, just as an overview, about 40% had administrative disapproval in the area of tactics. And this is because there's been a greater emphasis on de-escalation, the use of the patrol acronym, and command and control in those evaluation categories. We'd like to turn now to an overview of the other categorical use of force incidents, and these will involve carotid restraint control holds, head strikes, in custody deaths, and Learys. So we'd like to take a look at this next data slide. And in categorical uses of force that were not officer-involved shootings, we are trending down in all of the areas that you see right now on your screen and those data points. So with CRCH, that denotes carotid restraint control holds, there was 1 in 2019, remaining unchanged from 2018. And it was the result of a radio call generated response by officers, and it took place in Operation South Bureau. It is still under adjudication.
Excuse me, Chief.
Yes.
I think we have to take a moment. Give me one moment, please.
Yes.
Mr. Tifang, could you, I'm not sure if we lost Mr. Soboroff or not. I want to be sure we maintain a quorum at all times. Please let me know, Mr. Tifang.
I just reached out to him, ma'am.
Thank you. Chief Kramala, we have to just take a pause until we have a quorum. Thank you.
Understood.
Thank you, Chief Kramala. Please proceed.
And we held a consistent number of 1 that occurred in South Bureau. It was generated from a radio call, and it is still going through the adjudication process. Looking at law enforcement related injuries, again trending down, 4 in 2019, which is a 33% reduction by 2 incidents compared to 2018. As we look at sources of activity for the law enforcement related injuries, 3 out of the 4 were generated out of radio calls for service, or 75%, and 1 out of the 4 involved in officer observation. 3 out of the 4 Learys occurred in Central Bureau, and 1 occurred in South Bureau. When we looked at suspect information, ethnicities regarding those Learys, 3 out of the 4 involved Hispanic suspects, and 1 involved an African American suspect. Looking at gender, all the suspects were male, and the age range was 40 to 49. We had 1 was 17 years of age, 1 was 50 to 59, and 1 was in the over 60 population. What is notable also is there was a decrease in Leary incidents with suspects with perceived mental illness. 2 out of the 4, or 50% of the Leary cases, involved a suspect who was perceived to be suffering from a mental health crisis or mental illness. This is a 33% decrease compared to 83% in 2018. In the Leary cases, just briefly, the force used by suspects in 3 of the 4 was physical force, and in 1 involved an edged weapon. Also still in the Leary discussion, 2 out of the 4 suspects, or 50%, involved in a Leary incident were homeless. As we look at head strikes, again, we saw a reduction. And a head strike, just for the purposes of discussion here, is an intentional head strike with an impact device or weapon, or all unintentional head strikes that result in serious bodily injury, hospitalization, or death. And in this particular single instance, the head strike incident resulted from a radio call. It occurred in Operations West Bureau, and the person was perceived to be suffering from mental illness, homeless, and was armed with a metal rod. That is still undergoing the adjudication process. With regard to canine contacts, notable as well, this is the 2nd year of a 1 incident only. And a canine contact, again, for members of the public who may be tuning into this presentation, is when a member of the public has a contact with a canine and hospitalization is required. So as we look historically, the department is down 69% in canine contacts when we look back in the aggregate from 2015 through 2019. Also, something worth discussing here is that the department policy on the use of canine is for the canine to be utilized to find a suspect and bark, not to find a suspect and bite. I think that's very critical for us to emphasize here, because most and many departments in the United States use the find and bite policy rather than find and bark. And that involves great training, great discipline, not only by handlers, but extensive training for canines, so that you're almost training out instinctual behavior from the animal. And in this particular case, for those interested, the suspect attempted to choke the canine, which resulted in the bite and a brief period of hospitalization. Now I'd like to look at in custody death. And the in custody death category is defined as the death of an arrestee or detainee who is in the custodial care of the Los Angeles Police Department. And as we look at the number 3, we see it to be a decrease of 57% from what we were seeing and experiencing in 2018. Where there were 2 out of the 3 of the in-custody death incidents resulted from officers' observations, and 1 was in a custodial setting. And right here, although we're going to be talking about training in a larger scope toward the end of the presentation very soon, I just want to focus on Custody Services Division and in-custody death, and talk about what we saw in 2019. And I know the Commission has been extremely interested in the department taking a close look at our procedures and policies and training with regard to detention officers in those custodial settings. So there's 4 points I just want to briefly highlight as we look and reflect on this slide. In 2019, there was a revision to the inmate intake form of every single person that comes through our doors for booking and processing. And why this is so notable is it added mental health related questions, and also the requirement that a check be done with the mental evaluation unit and documented prior to the acceptance of that particular inmate. And that was a proactive move. It was a move for us to be forward thinking and trying to prevent problems and identify problems before they could begin for the inmate and as well as for the employees within the custodial setting. In addition, a second Title 15 check was done and instituted by divisional order, in addition to the one required by the state every hour for inmates within the LAPD's custodial setting. That is further enhanced by an audit by a supervisor once every shift to determine if the employees are doing the 2, not 1, but 2 Title 15 checks. Thirdly, Custodial Services Division also enhanced their mental health training, going from 10 hours to 24 hours. And fourthly, within the recruit training for detention officers, 24 additional hours of de-escalation, proactive communication, and tactical de-escalation involving the mentally ill or potentially suicidal inmates was done. And we think that this was extremely important as we look at over 74,000 people who come through the doors of the 3 regional jails or the department's few open station jails as well. So I just thought that that was extremely important to point out to the Commission. So thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to do so. So as we look at in-custody deaths in closing with regard to bureaus, Operation Central Bureau had 1, South Bureau had none, Valley Bureau had 1, West Bureau had none, and Custody Services Division had 1 instance. I'd like to turn now to the discussion on non-categorical uses of force. And this includes both the use of less lethal munitions and non-lethal use of force. So there were 2,320 non-categorical use of force incidents in 2019. And once again, for discussion, this encompasses both less lethal and non-lethal. When we talk about an increase in non-categorical uses of force, this was an increase of 195 incidents citywide compared to 2018, or 9%. So in the slide right now that you're looking at, we just wanted to highlight some of the less lethal munitions and those that either saw an increase in use, a decrease in use, or no change. So when we look at oleoresin capsicum, or OC spray, also known as pepper spray, we see no change in its deployment in non-categorical use of forces. The taser experienced a 10% decrease. The beanbag, a 20% decrease. An increase of 38% in the use of the baton. So this went from 33 applications in 2019 compared to 24 in 2018. And we saw a significant increase in the 40 millimeter less lethal launcher in these incidents. Looking at 2018, we had 33 applications, and there were 62 in 2018. And just for the sake of this discussion, comparing the beanbag shotgun use to the 40 millimeter, the 40 millimeter can be used at increased distances up to 110 feet from a suspect, and also is known for increased accuracy. Yet when you look at the span of all of these less lethal munition systems, they average between 50 and 53% in efficacy. So as we look over a 5-year period, physical application of force, and this is takedowns, strikes, body weight, firm grips, and joint locks, when you have officers in close quarters with hands-on suspects, we saw an increase of 27%. And those are the non-lethal areas. So I thought that's important to point out for the sake of the members of the public watching, as well as the commissioners. So those are non-lethal uses of force. So we would prefer, as we see here, an increase in those areas over the use of less lethal munitions. And that's what we saw in 2019 with a decrease of 24% in the use of impact devices. And that's what you saw depicted in the screenshot just prior to this. So now we'd like to take a brief look at the force options applied in a breakdown in 2019. So the taser was deployed in 282 of the 2,320 non-categorical use of force situations, which equates to about 12%. The beanbag shotgun was used in 48 of the 2,320 instances of non-categorical use of force, or 2%. The 40 millimeter launcher was used 3% of the time in 62 cases. Strikes, punches, or kicks were used 171 times in the totality of the 2,320 non-categorical use of force cases. And impact devices such as batons, 33 from the total amount of non-categorical use of force. And you can see the balance there occurring in firm grip, joint locks, takedown, leg sweep, and body weight. Again, non-lethal options in the use of force realm. As we look now, a quick shot at the bureaus of occurrence. We see the most to have occurred, our next slide. In Operation Central Bureau, 700, 570 in South Bureau, West Bureau with 389, and Valley Bureau 616. And if you're doing the count, we had some non-categorical use of force incidents which occurred outside the jurisdiction of the city of Los Angeles. Looking at the next slide on suspect injuries, we just want the commission to take note of the 2019 numbers. And when we talk about non-categorical use of force and injuries, it's important to note they do include complaint of pain, where someone may feel soreness or some type of inflammation after a non-categorical use of force, visible injuries, which could be a scratch, a scrape, etc. So we just want to, as we review those large numbers, to put it in the context of what injuries are defined as for this discussion. We turn now to look at suspects with perceived mental illness. And there were 753 out of the total number of instances, or 31%. 2% increase from 2018, and also a 2% increase from the span of time of 2015 through 2018. With regard to our next slide of perceived impairment, looking at 41% of the non-categorical uses of force. We have an issue here. Pardon us, Tony.
Yeah, Chief, if you could give us a moment, we lost the slides.
Yes.
Let's see if we can bring them back.
Okay. Okay, we only have a couple left, so.
All right, if there were only a couple, Chief, why don't you proceed then?
Yes, I'll go ahead and just verbally proceed. So with perceived impairment of suspects, there was 41% of the time during non-categorical uses of force where drugs or alcohol were detected as part of the processing of the arrestee. So we just thought that was important to note as well. With regard to non-categorical uses of force and homeless suspects, again, an important point for us to discuss here. 34% of the time in which an officer was engaged in a non-categorical use of force, the suspect was perceived to be homeless. And this was a 2% increase from 2018. As we move on to adjudication of the non-categorical uses of force, which you see in the slide here, again, 2018 numbers are all that are available to us, but I can tell you trending through that time period in 2018, 98% of the non-categorical uses of force met with administrative approval. But we should note that it is a very lengthy and multi-level review process which takes place as we examine each and every reportable use of force, which includes non-categorical and also includes the review of body-worn video and digital in-car video in those instances. Now I'd like to turn to a discussion on training and what training looks like. And when we talk about how are we ensuring that what we publish, what we train in classroom settings, in situation simulations, is something that officers are not only absorbing, but are able to apply in the field. And I think it's very important to note that the 3 points of contact that the department has with each and every employee to reinforce the tenets of de-escalation, tactical communication, and command and control are in sync like never before on the department. And the 3 areas we're talking about are publications that the department puts out, everything from revised manual sections to tactical operations briefings, to training bulletins. They're in sync and supportive both in verbiage and intent with the physical department training that officers are given. And at this point, I just want to provide acknowledgement to the Inspector General's office and to the commissioners who, through the use of force subcommittees, provide input into these publications so that we can be held accountable and ensure that our training and published documents reinforce one another and that the message is loud and clear to our officers. And then I think the third point in which we touch our employees with regard to use of force training in de-escalation, tactical communication, and command and control comes through the use of force review boards and the evaluation process, which consistently looks at what we're training to and what our expectations are with regard to department policy. So I think it's very important that we see that throughout the process of use of force, be it categorical or non-categorical, the department remains consistent and very firm and direct in its expectations of officers' behavior in order for us to maintain the level of trust that we seek with the members of the public. With regard to these next related training discussion points, I want to just extend my thanks to Dr. Luann Pinnell, who's the head of our police training and education for the department, which covers not only recruit basic training, but all of our in-service classes. And I collaborated with her and kind of fed off of some of her energy and information with regard to where we're at today in 2020, reflecting back on 2019's training as well. So it's important to share with you that as of January 2019, 41 of our post-certified courses have been completed and recertified with regard to the inclusion of tactical de-escalation and tactical communication. In addition, after every categorical use of force, the involved officers go through a general training update, which includes 6 mandatory topics of use of force policy, reverence for human life, tactical de-escalation, command and control, required equipment, reality-based training and performance. And this is very important that shortly after, usually within a week to 10 days of a categorical use of force incident, we are bringing those officers back into a setting of training with subject matter experts to reflect upon any issues of concern that may have come up in those very preliminary stages. And this is done by academy training staff, the best of our subject matter experts. And I wanted to assure the commission and members of the public on that, because when training could be done within the geographic areas, it may vary in the level of expertise that an instructor has, a level of proficiency, fresh proficiency, and by assuring that training division staff are involved, we get exactly what we are looking for with regard to training standards. In addition, officers that go through categorical uses of force, every single one, regardless of the type or the level of competency, must go through a tactical debrief without exception. In the past, going back 10, 15, 20 years, and I'm sure Chief Moore remembers this, having been the chair of use of force boards, that tactical debrief was not necessarily something that was always required. And we believe that regardless of how that categorical use of force went, we need to ensure that training remains fresh and we never have enough of it. In addition, for all officers on the department, we continue with standardized roll call training each shift that an officer works, again, to help re-emphasize critical training focuses. All of this training is paired with the 2-year training cycles from post. The expectation level that the department has with regard to training comes from, as I said, the use of force boards, evaluation of non-categorical uses of force, and also, very importantly, state and national trends and best practices. Weekly, usually, or more correctly, monthly, Chief Moore will send his direct reports information on state and national trends in best practices for us as a department and specifically for training division to take a look at, review, explore, to see if there's something better, fresher, and more in line with departmental, commission, and public expectations of our use of force. And that keeps us fresh and never believing that LAPD has all the answers with regard to training and use of force. Let me continue now with discussing the importance of challenging scenarios incorporated into all of our in-service training. We need to develop the full officer, and the way we do that is by presenting scenarios that easily could replicate themselves in the field and challenge our officers there. So every time we get the opportunity to train officers, we need to expose them to situation simulated scenarios. Looking quickly at recruit training, we exceed the post mandates of 664 hours, providing 912 hours of training to our recruits. Each of our training courses within the academy setting, when officers must return, regardless if they are supervisory courses, watch commander training, detective school, all incorporate use of force policy, emphasis with reverence for human life, and tactical de-escalation skills. And there are a total of 61 lesson plans in total that incorporate all of those tenets. Also, with the establishment of tactical de-escalation, the directive that came out at the end of 2016, during the part one of this presentation, we discussed that the patrol acronym was being introduced in 2016 and continued to be used to debrief all scenarios in which officers are involved. Also, there have been 2 department-wide training courses that have concluded that touched every single member of the department in use of force and in integrating communications, de-escalation, and crowd control. For the use of force update, 8,826 officers were trained. For communication, de-escalation, and crowd control, 7,796 officers were trained. Now, currently, we are going through command and control school. 5,026 department employees have been trained. And command and control school involves use of force overview, incident command, procedural justice, and 3 very difficult scenarios to challenge critical thinking, and of course, de-escalation. We hope to ramp up the command and control training to continue to train the additional officers and supervisors on the department as we look and explore training in the time of COVID and practicing hygiene and safe social distancing as we move forward with accomplishing the goal of getting every member of the department trained. We have PSL1 and PSL2, police science leadership, and PSL1 incorporates 8 hours of MHIT training in that course. And for those of you who may not be familiar with PSL1 and 2, it's the return of officers once they've been out in the field. For PSL1, it's approximately 18 months after they went into the field to bring them back and explore their experiences, reflect on how training helped or how training needed to be improved in what they experienced out there as new officers. In addition, the Field Training Officer Program, that has now included 8 hours of MHIT training. That's the mental health intervention training, and crisis intervention as well. This is very important since one of the most influential people in a young police officer's life is a field training officer. They can learn great habits or sadly at times poor habits. And if our FTOs are not receiving timely training updates and are not also refreshed in dealing with persons who may be experiencing mental health crises, this could reflect on how a probationary officer is trained in the field. So we're very glad to see that incorporation of MHIT, the 8-hour course in the FTO program. In addition, looking at 2021, we will be incorporating a trauma care course for all department personnel. And this is something being developed with Dr. Kenji Inaba of Los Angeles County USC Medical Center. He's also a department reserve, and our cherished partners in the LAFD. And it underscores our commitment to the reverence and preservation of human life in field situations where there's a possibility that officers could provide first aid or some type of immediate medical measures to save lives. And we are waiting for a post-approval on this course, hopefully for it to begin in 2021. I also want to include just a brief conversation on the fact that training also extends to and includes Custody Services Division personnel, Security Services Division personnel, and Communication Division personnel, especially with regard to issues of mental health crises or mental health intervention. It's so important for us to see the other public safety employees who do impact how officers respond to calls, are dispatched for calls, or how individuals within our custody care and their welfare is incorporated into a broader vision to ensure that training is received by them as well. So now Custody Services Division officers, detention officers, receive 8 hours of training in mental health intervention. Security Services Division officers receive 8 hours as well, and Communication Division employees, or PSRs, receive 4 hours. And why is that so important, especially as we talk for a moment about Communication Division? We have 2 divisional orders from Communications Divisions. They're called Divisional Order 8 and 9. And why they're so important is as the intake of a call for service comes through their console, the importance in a situation where a suspect may have edged weapons now necessitates the dispatch of a unit or the assurance that less lethal munitions, in addition to a supervisor, are dispatched in those situations, as well as in calls where there's an indication that the suspect or persons involved or subject may be experiencing a mental health crisis. A supervisor and additional unit shall be dispatched. And this is extremely important so that we can ensure that resources are coming in addition to the officer that is being dispatched to the scene. So in conclusion, I hope that I gave a good blush of what department training looks like, the department's commitment to it as well in a variety of areas, but with specificity to use of force, which is our conversation here today. In conclusion now, I just want to give my thanks to the staff of Critical Incident Review Division for the data collection that made up not only the executive summary from which we drew, but also the nearly 400-page data collection on all use of force for 2019. They are not only talented in their ability to analyze and collect data, but also in their ability to put a presentation together. And to Captain Setzer and the team there, Lieutenant Wang, I thank you very much. Also to PTE, our personnel and police training and education, and our division through training, a division, pardon me for my misspeaking here, to Dr. Luann Pinnell, Chief Baeza and staff, thank you for your continued commitment to training. And to our partners in OO, I know OO was instrumental in pushing for the Communication Division orders that I just referenced. Those were Divisional Orders 8 and 9 to ensure that officers were given the support they needed, but also for suspects, victims, and persons reporting to feel that we were trying our best to properly handle the calls for a service or the needs of the public. And to Detective Bureau, Chief Frank, Chief Pitcher, for the commitment of your personnel to MHIT, the training to incorporate it not only in the 40-hour block of school, to which we have about 3,100 department personnel trained, but also in incorporating it and infusing it in every aspect of training for all of our support people, as well as officers and detective personnel. And that now concludes my report.
Thank you, Chief. And thank you for both presentations, both last week's and this week's. We'll now turn to commission questions. I do have a few. Sorry, I don't know why my video went out. There we go. I do have a few. Other commissioners, if you want to interrupt me or go first, I'm happy to let you do that. Just indicate by unmuting your microphone, but if I don't see you do that, I'll just dig into the questions. Chief Gramala, most of my questions, in fact, all of them, I've spent some time on this report, as I'm sure everyone has, looking at the numbers, and thank you for providing context to many of those numbers today. And I understand, and I think we were criticized last week for the presentation because some of these numbers can be disturbing and we're talking about them in somewhat a forensic way, but I think everyone here recognizes that there are lives behind all of these numbers, and what we're trying to do in analyzing them is help be better informed about how to get to the goal of lowering these numbers further. And so my questions revolve around that, Chief Gramala, on how to interpret all of these numbers in relation to each other. Because I note, or as I'm diving into them, I believe that no one number can be looked at on its own, and that they have a connection to one another. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is how do we, in looking at all of these numbers, and how does the department determine what is successful in moving forward, the strategies for moving forward on all of these issues, how to be better informed. You've talked about toxicology issues, weapons issues, the community efforts, the training issues, the de-escalation, mental health training, other training tools, and also other tools that have been provided to officers over the years. How do we put all of that together and determine what is the most effective way for moving forward in the year ahead? I'm interested from hearing from you. I'm interested in hearing from the operations folks on how these numbers are informing you, but also how you're using these numbers to impact your decisions moving forward, because it's a lot of data to go through.
Yes, thank you very much, Commissioner. I think, and I just want to preface this part of the conversation, that any loss of human life is a tragedy. In any situation, in any circumstance, regardless if it's an officer involved shooting, an in custody death, an injury due to a law enforcement related contact. I want to emphasize this, and thank you for pointing out the fact that it becomes clinical when we make these presentations. And I want to assure the members of the public that in no way, shape, or form, to those that may have lost a loved one or have been impacted by any of these uses of force, that there is any issue here by me, any members of the team, to make this a black and white, very sterile type of discussion. Sadly, when we talk about data, that's often what results. But I think when we look at the totality of our evaluation of use of force, we're looking at key indicators or key points where the department could enhance its training, could acknowledge where we could have done things better, and they could also have the dividends of less injury, less loss of life, less deployment of munitions. And we've seen over time a couple areas which had caused great concern for the department. And I know Chief Moore has talked about it in the past as well. This is a number of rounds fired, the number of officers who fire their weapons, our ability to connect and communicate with those who are suffering a mental health crisis, and the homeless as well. So I think as you look at the totality of the numbers, the point of us evaluating them is where can we find points of improvement with regard to our training, with regard to our expectations, and also, quite frankly, with regard to our policy. So when we looked at an overview of where refinements in policy needed to take place, with refinements with regard to dispatching of officers, we have focused on those because that's where we're seeing the most amount of concern. So I think we're weighing concerns, identified concerns, both internally from the commission and community, from the Inspector General, and then they help to evaluate key points of improvement. Chief Moore, I didn't want to take anything else you want to say away from you on that, or Chief Arcos as well, who I think is dialing in as well.
If Chief Arcos is here, I'd be interested in hearing from him. I'm not sure if the secretary is able to do that. I'm not sure he's on the line, but if he is, if we could bring him in, and I'll give you a few moments to bring him up. And just let me follow up, Chief Grimala, while we see if we can, if he's here, we can bring him up. But I think my question is a little bit of how we correlate all this data to ensure we're putting all of our efforts in the things that are most effective. I have no doubt that everything that the department does can be effective in some way. For example, training, certainly. Would it be helpful to put more effort in de-escalation training or mental health training? Or I'm looking to determine if the numbers inform anything more specific about what should be done. Greater efforts with the community, other tools that may be needed to deal with certain specific situations. The report certainly shows everything in totality, but as we move forward, should one area be given more weight than another, or are these numbers just not as informative as perhaps my question suggests they might be?
I think in a couple instances, we'll talk about non-lethal and less lethal force, for example. The department and the chief has asked us to continue to explore any available non-lethal type munitions that may be available anywhere in the marketplace. And the commission has allowed us to pilot, for example, the BOLA wrap. And the whole point of trying to introduce non-lethal munitions or additional less lethal munitions is to decrease, as we look at our officer-involved shootings, our use of lethal force in that categorical realm, to bring those numbers further down. And by the training being infused with de-escalation, tactical communication, again, in 61 total lesson plans that the department uses every single day, and once COVID allows us to bring up some more of that training, I think the department's continued pursuit of more options, better options, more non-lethal, more less lethal, is where these numbers impact and influence us, and the public sentiment does as well. Because what we're looking to do is to de-escalate, to hope that tactical communication can bring a resolution, to hope that increased training in mental health awareness and identification can help us to de-escalate every single one of our community contacts out there. So I think that the continued pursuit by the department of alternate means to de-escalate, including command and control training, inserting supervisors into any public context, is critical. And I know I just see Chief Arcos. Hi, Bobby. I see you just joined us. I don't want to steal the discussion from the Office of Operations, but I think you've probably been hearing what we've been discussing.
Yeah, I have B, and to Commissioner Decker and all the commissioners. I'm on, Jeannie.
You're on.
Yes, I'm on. Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Chief Grimala and her leadership and her team for that really thorough presentation. And to Commissioner Decker's question, I think Chief Grimala has covered a number of those items that I would definitely underscore. And it's no surprise to our commission and to our chief of police. This department is a statistical-driven, metric-driven department. And your point is well taken, Commissioner, on what's beyond the numbers, what's underneath the numbers. When we peel that back, what does it actually mean to our men and women and how they are doing their job effectively, and where we can get better through training, through tracking, accountability, policy or procedure. So that is really our charge at the Office of Operations, to not just look at plus or minus in percentages of non-categorical uses of force or categorical uses of force, pursuits, the whole spectrum of risk management. We really want to get deeper into the cause and effect of those numbers and apply the appropriate response. It's additional training, maybe it's a change in policy, it's a creation of additional tools that we've just received over the last couple of years with the 40 millimeter, now the BolaWrap, all those things that are at our disposal to really help us be much more competent and confident in doing our job for de-escalation. So, you know, the Chief Grimala really did eloquently speak on all the different things that are at our disposal, from training division and to the bulletins, the updates, et cetera. All those things are at our disposal from the Office of Operations to add on to the type of training we give at the baseline level of our department. Starts with roll call training and the debriefing of the incidents. And that's really where we focus on really trying to identify those current trends, but give it much more of substance than just a statistical number, or again, as I said, a metric. So I hope that answers some of your asks there, Commissioner.
Some, yes. And I'm wondering, Chief Argos, and perhaps this is also a question for Chief Grimala. I'll leave to you both to decide. I'd like to know how you're going to use all the data that's been collected, which is very detailed, in planning your year ahead. What differences or what changes do you plan to make? How is this informing your decision making, both perhaps for operations and for training? And within your answer, I hope you include a little information on the homeless, the people experiencing homeless issues that were highlighted in the report, and the increased use of force that the report indicates for 2019.
If I could just start out, Commissioner Decker, and Bobby, I'll turn it to you. Chief Arcos and I have discussed a meeting between the Office of Operations and the Office of Support Services, particularly a training bureau, to take a look at this report. This report just came out in its totality approximately 5 weeks ago. And always, you know, sometimes we always feel we're looking backwards, but it's important in this respect, as Chief Arcos and I have discussed, that we're going to sit down as office directors, bring in Chief Frank as well, Liz Rhodes from the Office of Constitutional Policing and Policy, and sit down and ask ourselves, as the Chief's direct reports, what does this really mean with regard to where we go in 2020 and beyond? And Chief Arcos and I have had these conversations. So we take these numbers and now plot out what we see as a path moving forward and present that to the Chief of Police, to Chief Moore, at a future direct report for discussion. So just for everybody who may be listening, we also have just seen this report in its totality and are absorbing it as well, not just for the purposes of a presentation and for information, but for a guidebook, if you will, to what the future may lead. And some of the things in the past that have come out of these year-end reports have been something that I know that Chief Arcos, you instituted in the Office of Operations, for example, mandatory MHIT training for his HOPE teams. This was something that came out of the review, past reviews of the year-end report, and we can see reflective in the HOPE teams and officer-involved shootings. We just had one instance of that, and that was an animal shooting that occurred in the valley where sadly, as officers were going about their tasks, a dog jumped out of a tent and came aggressively at an officer. So my hat's off to Chief Arcos in taking this data from the past, and he's shown that he's done it in employing what we see in the future. Also the same thing with, for example, edged weapons and officer-involved shootings. It's one thing to look at numbers, but should those numbers translate in a policy change or a procedure change for the department? And we answered that question, and yes, it did, and that's causing the dispatch, mandatory dispatch of less lethal munitions to calls where edged weapons come up in the information received by dispatch. And as a result, in the last 3 years, we've seen a decrease in officer-involved shootings involving edged weapons. And Chief Arcos, I know the Office of Operations was instrumental in working with OSS to ensure that those changes were made to dispatch procedures. So Bobby, I turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, B. Thanks for really filling in all those gaps there for our work together and going forward, and just really trying to digest all the information from the use of force end of the year report moving forward. And I guess you've already captured really the essence of examples of previous reports on the edge weapon response and protocol, the 40 millimeter dispatch, the MHIT training, and to Commissioner Decker's question, no one really knows it better than the impact on working with persons experiencing homelessness and mental illness. Commander Graham works directly out of the Office of Operations. That was a great move by the Chief of Police to align that under the Office of Operations. So we really have real-time information on the training and the perspective of the impact that our HOPE teams and Reset in Skid Row is having in their relationships on the streets with persons experiencing homelessness and mental illness. And we know that this best practice coming out of our mental health unit and our HOPE teams really needs to extend much greater across the department, which we are trying to do through training division to get them through that. It's proven, again, to give much greater understanding of our officers that are responding to these types of calls of persons experiencing homelessness to help really reduce and minimize the number of uses of force that are occurring. I know we've seen really great results from HOPE team contacts over the years. That metric is reported to you through the commission, through our homeless updates and reports, and we'll continue to look at ways we can get better through this information. I think one of the things that we really kind of take for granted, but the body-worn video information that we are seeing, certainly there are things that we always identify that we can get better at in debriefing, but there's a number of instances in these videos where we see the work from training division, the supervisory updates, watch commander school, de-escalation, the patrol acronym getting put to work. And we actually see, we need to highlight that much broader and greater in our debriefings at roll call, and use those as greater examples for the results that are being really positively shown in these body-worn videos. Great supervisory command and control that is really not being enhanced enough, and that falls on me to make sure that we do much more to really leverage the work that's being done from the patients that is being exhibited by our officers in the field.
Thank you. Thank you both. I have a few more questions, but I think I may ask my fellow commissioners to jump in now so I don't hold the floor too long on these questions. Commissioner Bonner, I see you've unmuted your microphone, sir.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you. First, a couple of just brief observations, and then a couple of questions for Chief Grimala and then Chief Moore. First, I do, appreciate the report. It's I'm going to, assuming it's a high quality report, accurate data, and all the rest. And I accept that, it indicates that statistically speaking, the use of force is relatively infrequent, and again, statistically speaking, the incidents of inappropriate use of force are relatively rare. I was pleased to hear Chief Grimala acknowledge that, of course, if you're a family or relative of someone who's lost their way and ended up on the other side of confrontation with the police, this kind of data is a little comfort. And so we'll still continue to be trying to look past the statistics and ask, what more we can do to raise the bar, to bring the numbers down continually, and to really, continue to improve the performance in this area. I also want to note that, this is an important discussion. Use of force is an important issue, but it's not the only issue, because it, just as the report itself is a lagging indicator, many times when you get to the point of using force or having to use force, that itself is a lagging indicator of a broader set of reforms and criminal justice system reforms and things that need to be considered to make sure that we're really trying to get the police focused on the most serious threats in communities and looking for alternatives to arrest, incarceration, and ways to address the root causes of crime and so on. So I'm just acknowledging again that it's a useful exercise to look a lot of the data, but just emphasizing that it's important that we not lose sight of the broader context in which it's being presented. With that, a couple of questions. First, quickly for Chief Grimala, and these are requests for some data and information. So if you have it available now, which would be great, but if not, just ask you to pull it together. The first question relates to the data relative to the suspects. And I'm wondering if you're looking across use of force generally, not just the officer-involved shootings, but if you were looking across the full spectrum of use of force, do we know how many of the suspects are people who are on probation or parole?
Mr. Bonner, I don't have that information now, but it is something that I could go ahead and obtain for you and either report back to the commission in writing or come back and report back to you.
Yeah, either way will be fine. And just again, for broader context, part of there's a number of thoughts behind the question, but one broad question is trying to understand really, some of the other issues. I referenced some of the reform issues that are in play, and I'm trying to understand the connection between the bail reforms and recidivism, and how many of the people who actually are involved in some sort of use of force are in some way caught up in that set of issues. So I'm trying to understand that a little bit better. Secondly, you mentioned a number of training and other policy and procedures and things that are underway. I think this is just building on Commissioner Decker's question about what specific things may be in play to continue to improve the performance in these areas. And so I just want to express my interest in that set of issues as well when that comes forward. And really, I wanted to ask a couple questions to the chief. I assume I don't see him on one of the boxes here, but I'm sure he's still here with us. Is that fair? Is Chief Moore still in with us somewhere?
Yes, I see him on the screen, Mr. Bonner.
Okay, great.
Yes, he's here. He's here.
And Chief, I'm asking these questions to you because I hope and assume you would agree that as the leader of the department that ultimately, from a command and control standpoint, that you have to assume responsibility for managing the use of force across the board. And unfortunately, I acknowledge that when you're chief, you're in that kind of bubble where probably all your jokes are funny and all your ideas are great ideas. And so you may or may not, have your finger on the pulse of everything that you would like to have your finger on the pulse of on any given day. But the first question really is from a management standpoint, as you try to manage this, what early warning systems or mechanisms are you looking at or having your supervisors or command staff look at to, number one, identify officers who are potentially at risk of misusing force so that we can, identify potential, threats to the public before they're actually involved in an incident. And also how you, have your finger on measuring policy and procedures that may need some sort of adjustment. I mean, the use of force, report is helpful, but it's a look back. So I'm just curious if you could speak for a minute on, how you, as you're managing the process, look for those earlier warning systems and adjustments that might need to be made.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think I'm up now.
Yes.
So thank you for the opportunity to respond to that. And really, before I begin that, I would like to extend my appreciation to Chief Grimala for all her work and her team's work in pulling together this report. It is one of the most critical tools that we use. And while it is a lagging indicator, as you indicated, Commissioner, it is important to us as we look at so many different data points and so many different interactions and the tens of thousands that can come from them, is how do we take a step back and start looking at year over year trends and differences. And I'm proud that this report, which is in its existence now for either the 5th or 6th year, I think has achieved its desired results, which when we began in 2014 and 2015 had very pressing concerns about our reliance on the use of deadly force, circumstances that those facts and those events were found that we judged, of course, as a commission, the body before you, judged on an individual basis, but as a department, as a chief, how do we look at them strategically and see what we can learn from interactions, not just the use of deadly force and use of categorical use of force, but also into the interactions that occur with reportable uses of force. So that's one mechanism for me. I've looked at it each year. Now Deputy Chief John McMahon was actually a captain at Themwa's Use of Force Review Division and partnered with me in formulating the first report. And from it, in each successive year, we've identified the role of training, of tools, and of accountability. And this report is one of my barometers in understanding how are we staying ahead of this challenge. I mean, the commitment I have with my appointment, and I know every police officer has, is to build and maintain trust in the community. And the use of force, and particularly deadly force, is one of the most critical issues of that, of maintaining that trust or building trust. Because whether it's, these are not statistics, these are individual lives. And whether it's 1 million cycles or it's only 10 interactions, the interaction where an officer resorts to deadly force or uses any force should be closely scrutinized, and we should constantly look at the system of our system of how we go about policing the city in both our selection of our personnel and the training and guidance of our personnel, and the way in which we discipline our personnel for when they make mistakes, whether those be purposeful or otherwise, with maintaining 21st century awareness of what are the emerging tools, but also how are we informed by our communities as to their expectations of our performance and roles of policing. As you said, this is not all captured in just one aspect. This has an impact on all of the overlay of policing here in Los Angeles. So for me, this is one major element. 2 decades ago now, we enjoy a system today called the TEAMS system, which categorizes risk management measures that involve officer conduct, both on and off duty, as well as simple things like their attendance and their use of sick time or injury time to understand underlying risk factors, but also the manner in which they are subject to public complaints or internal complaints for misconduct and the outcomes of those complaints, the instances in which they resort to force, the number of arrests or citations and engagements they have in the community, what their training and background is in the sense of what education they have both on the job as well as in service, but also what do they bring as far as added education preparedness to the function of being a police officer. Their rank histories are of course important, but also important is levels of citizen commendations and recognition for awards and achievements that they've achieved. And in that system is also the non-categorical and categorical use of force history, and the citations and other measures of what their performance is. And the TEAM system was built as the outgrowth of the Rampart scandal and earlier disappointments where this city and this department failed its communities because we didn't recognize early on emerging behavior, and we weren't able to intercede without a person becoming a part of a major scandal or a unit becoming a part of a scandal that rocked the city. And so from that, the TEAMS process was built. It has within it measures of what we call thresholds for where behavior statistically starts falling outside the norm and brings a red flag so that people such as Chief Farkos and his deputy chiefs and area captains and supervisors are, while they're involved in work and they see their work in interplay, they are alerted that there's behavior emerging that is outside of what is more typically found in other like assigned personnel. And so that system is important because it generates alerts for supervisors to then evaluate. And what we know critically is that we've seen in the background the importance of first line supervision and how that's also failed the organization. So critical in that TEAMS process is review by the area captain and patrol captain, and also the engagement by the bureau chief, that he or she is satisfied that the early warning system is resulting in the proper accountability and assessment, and that we identify potentially problematic behavior. We provide counseling, training, but also corrective action if necessary. And that can include everything from added training, but it can also include changing of assignments. It can also include restrictions on what they do. So that's the master system, but it's informed also by our CompStat process, which, as regular on page 2 of the CompStat process, is a number of performance measures of an individual command and then benchmarked against prior years, but also like commands and citywide numbers. So there's a lot of numbers in that work, but those two systems are critical for me of an organization of 13,000 involved, as you see, in millions of encounters a year, in order to identify where are people statistically perhaps showing some signs of wear and tear, or some signs of not having the skills, knowledge, and abilities necessary, or character to be a member of this organization. And it's meant also to identify in a positive, reinforcing manner that there are people and supervisors providing that training, that guidance, and those action items are developing individuals into staying on the right course. Now, built in this process, of course, is that in each major investigation is the briefings regarding conduct, and we see in the quarterly reports on discipline, where we see the performance of our officers on and off duty. Those are areas that I look for measures to understand how are we going about in our work and training and guiding, but also holding our people to the right core set of values. In addition to that is a 72-hour briefing, is the matter today in closed session with two categoricals, and how were those performances. But those are so much of an echo effect, because there are instances that are occurring months before. So we also depend on the weekly briefings that we have in the morning of understanding what critical instances have occurred. And when we start seeing matters that are drawing our attention early that may not show up on one of these reports for months or a year, is that we stay proactive. Last year is a good example of that, where command and control was bore out of observations relative to the number of officers and their performance, and certainly their first line, the most senior officer at a scene, taking charge and designating those individuals that would be responsible for the various tactics of a scene, of a critical incident. And we found gaps, and we found and saw an emerging sense of that there were 5 people present and nobody was stepping into that responsibility. And so we put videos together, and we started training and emphasizing this in the roll call setting. And in our senior staff meeting with, let's talk about this, let's debrief our instances that are not amounting to these highly critical events that come to your attention, but let's debrief those minor instances and talk about command and control, talk about job assignments, talk about holstering weapons rather than having many unholstered. So those are the type of tactical matters that build in this organization. I'm proud that this is an organization that the importance of each individual in the field is in charge of his or her responsibility of solving a problem, addressing an emergency. But then they have oversight, and in building that oversight, the review process is meant to refine the work positively in a building manner, but also in a sense that when we find errors, that we call it out and we hold people accountable so people understand the limits to their work. That's kind of a quick spray, if you will, of what my activities and what my senior team does as they go about managing this organization.
Right, and I think that's very helpful, at least, and I'm reminded about the teams and CompStat system. But just to be clear, now this is a quite from a management style standpoint. I'm interested in understanding how you've identified a number of systems and processes in place that, as you indicated, are looked at from supervisors on up to the command staff. So when you add all that up, how much is the chief of police directly and personally engaged in the process of proactively identifying and addressing these issues? Now, I'm certainly not expecting that that's what you spend all your day doing, but I'm just asking you to share with us, reflect on, is it something that you take a direct and personal and regular interest in, or do you respond when matters are brought to your attention and there's a close call to be made or something along those lines?
No, not the latter. That was a style of leadership in this organization perhaps decades ago. Chief Bratton would probably said it best that, and when he came and arrived here 20 years ago, there was a style in which people would say, well, this is the first time it's been brought to my attention. and as a senior member of the organization or a staff or command officer. And his immediate response was, well, that doesn't tell me anything other than that you're disconnected and uninvolved. And he expects the involvement of the entire leadership team, as I do. I learned from what his leadership style was. And at the same time, you've got to give your people through the chain of command all the way down to the ground level. You've got to give them the discretion and the authority to go out and the responsibility to go out and do the best job they can, but an oversight and a situational awareness of how that goes. Our system of the department's operations since that point has only, with the use of technology such as phones and emails and text messaging and video conferencing, has only gone to reinforce the importance of making every effort to maintain situational awareness. The example of this is last Wednesday was our first reinstatement of our CompStat process because since the pandemic struck us, and we went. I want to thank Chief John McMahon and his team, and bringing the Microsoft Teams solution to this would allowed us to bring in South Bureau commands and have a virtual CompStat meeting to evaluate their performance. I monitored. I sat on that, as did Chief Arcos, listening to the inspection led by Chief Pitcher of each of the two commands, Southeast and 77th. And while I didn't weigh in on it, Chief Arcos and I spoke later about the response times of routine calls that I saw and some of the responses I heard from command officers. And he and I shared the mutual concern about whether or not that had somewhat become less important. Routine calls in 77th have now grown to just over 70 minutes on average to average response time. That well exceeded the department's average by 10, 15 minutes. And I take that dive, that moment. My style is to dive into those moments, but not smother, I hope, the responsibilities of each of the levels of this to actually activate and move. And I know Chief Scott from South Bureau and Commander Labrada are on that and working on both 77th and Southeast as to their prioritization of those routine calls, because we recognize that people who call the police, it may not be an emergency, but they deserve to have a timely service in that portion of the city as in every portion of the city. So to that granularity, I will say my history, I think that I'm much more involved in those than maybe other members of the organization have been. And my key is not to be dominant and not to just sit on top of people where they don't feel they have the need. I was very pleased to hear Chief Grimala and Chief Arcos speak about the importance of command and control, the value of our 40 millimeter less lethal system, the expansion of our communication protocols, and the desire that we continue to find innovative ways such as a bolo wrap and other tools to bring these numbers down even further. Chief Decker and I Commissioner Decker and I spoke earlier about this opportunity to hear the senior leadership of this team, and not just Chief Moore, echo what the significant findings of this report are, but also where our concerns are. And I think our concerns will continue to be in the area of lessening the instances of deadly force and non-categoricals, particularly involving persons experiencing homelessness, is how do we continue to get training in this critical time? How do we reinstitute our in-service training and get the hands-on work of reinforcing the capabilities of our people to deal with these difficult circumstances in a COVID period, which has really suspended our ability to have that type of
let me interject there quickly because you touched on my my second or my last question relative to training. Chief Grimala mentioned in-service training a number of times and detailed some of the efforts that are being made there. And again, I'm asking not to recount those efforts. I'm asking again a question about your personal level of engagement relative to the entire organization. So the question really is, how would you, and part of the concern that sometimes you hear, she mentioned the field training officers and how important they are. And sometimes there's a suggestion that that your interest in the seriousness of training in some cases may diminish with years of service. I'm not saying that's established, and that's a concern that some people have. How would you characterize, what do you personally know about, and how would you characterize the prevailing mindset or culture and attitude towards training on the part of experienced officers?
I think we have some of the most mature officers that look at and are lifelong learners. I also think we have likely individuals at times that come to a training as a matter of an obligation and may not have a readiness to learn or to explore and check the elasticity of their mind. That's why I really value Dr. Purnell. She recognizes and understands clearly the adult learner and the different stages. We hire, as you know, we hire people in their 20s and 30s, and then they work with us in their 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. And so they are along various life stages and their own personal standing as far as their existence. And so training and providing development and particularly changing mindsets and evolving this culture of policing, which has continued to evolve and I think always will, it does take ingenuity and it takes responsible, clear-eyed look. The current matter, in fact, that's before us is because field officers update as well as training officers, those new field training officers, that class has been suspended because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we looked, and so we need to get that back going again. And I challenged this group and they came up with a couple of different proposals. And at the end of the day, the point was we need to do this in person. This, as a team, we spoke about how do we do this in person, because this is not the type of training that works well on a Teams website, that works well remotely. We're talking to the inner workings of officers' minds as they're training the next generation of officers and this next generation of policing. And that critical 40-hour week, we need to find ways of doing it in person safely. So we're putting protocols in place to check temperatures, do social distancing, do safeguards for that. We're going to actually take and test each participant prior to them coming to the class to verify that they're COVID negative. But those are the means of, I guess that's the level of chief's involvement, is that we're getting to those details because strategically it is critical that the next generation of training officers be of a mindset that the senior management here is casting as our organizational intent and strategic direction. Lastly, I will say that this organization has not always done well in the in-service arena versus its recruit training. We've seen some of the most progressive recruit trainers, that next generation, only to see an in-service division filled with a generation gone by, or take adjunct professors out of the geographic areas or specialized assignments and have them come in and spew some information that actually was misconduct and was wrong, but also poisoned the well. And so I rely very deeply on that experience, that we audit those classes whenever possible. And I'm thankful for the Inspector General's presence also of attending those classes and providing us candor when they believe that, and we've heard this from time to time. I think today we're much better than 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. But there would be open arguments in a training class about the use of deadly force as a last resort and preservation of life. And that's where, the Inspector General's involvement and us coming to terms with learning that and then investing and drawing our attention to change that. And so that's something, but that's a system that has to go on every single day in every action that builds by week, month, and year. And you get a perpetual force. Doesn't mean it gets it right. We're going to find mistakes and shortfall, but our commitment is to continuous improvement.
Well, I appreciate that. And just let me just say in closing that, it's on the one hand encouraging to hear the list of training activities and adjustments and things along the way. But at least in my opinion, at the end of the day, the effectiveness of all that is going to turn on how seriously it's taken and how much it's integrated into the psyche of every officer and therefore into the culture of the organization. So it sounds, like one of those fluffy terms, but at the end of the day, since we can't manage only by statistics and lagging indicators, it's really going to be as important to make sure that we're cultivating a culture that embraces the spirit of the changes that you're trying to bring about. So,
Commissioner, I see Chief Arcos would like to say something. Arcos.
Thank you, Commissioner Decker. I just wanted to add one point. I definitely agree with the chief on the lifelong learners and those who feel that it's an obligation to show up to in-service training. But what I've seen and the feedback that I've received, really the work of OSS, Chief Grimala, Aiza, L, and Commander Flores, training today is not as perfunctory as it used to be and death by PowerPoint, for lack of a better term. It's more facilitative, it's engaging. The officers have a role to interact with the facilitators and the instructors. So I think that is much more beneficial to cultivating that mindset of there's a takeaway value when they leave in-service training. Just wanted to make sure I added that.
Appreciate that. Thank you. That's what I had. All I had, Commissioner Decker.
Thank you. Commissioner Soboroff, I see you would like to speak, sir. Go ahead.
Sure. As I did in each of the past 5 years, I've read this report carefully and watched its evolvement. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to the key contributors who have continued to improve this report. And by improvement, I don't necessarily mean positive spin the report. What I mean is go deeper and deeper. This is difficult work. Your critical incident review division folks, your sergeants, your traffic people. There are 46 people mentioned in here, in addition to B. Gramala, Bobby Arcos, Horace Frank, Robert Green, Liz Rhodes, and Luann Pinnell. So this report is a more detailed and more transparent report than ever. It is unprecedented in transparency for other departments around the country to look at and to follow. And it's working. The changes in the numbers are what we're looking at. The numbers are going down as the situations are becoming more difficult. This is a tool in looking forward, and I think Commissioner Decker asked the question eloquently: is how do you use this report to make to affect the statistics and the strategies of the department in the near future? Well, there's some things that have changed dramatically in the 5 years. There are new opportunities for de-escalation with new equipment, with less lethal equipment, with different and updated training, what needs to be trained, the levels of it, and the abilities change dramatically as the situations in the community and the world change. The extensive training I talked about, and also I think community involvement, both positive and negative, have had positive effect. I think criticism can have positive effect, and certainly the hundreds and hundreds of communications in meetings at churches and all over the community, CPABs, etc., have positive effects for future impact. I'm interested in a couple things. Shots fired per officer per incident. I mean, there are so few incidents out of the millions of calls to have 24 officer-involved shootings. But sometimes you look and say, well, how many shots per officer are being fired, and what's evolving in the training for an officer to make 1 or 2 or 3 shots, hold back, reassess, etc. Because that number is a number that has increased. I also, in closing, I believe that communication with a capital C in 2 areas: 1, between command staff and 2 officers in the field, and 2, between officers on the scene, are critical in changing a categorical use of force to potentially eliminating it and moving it to something else. I can't overstate the importance for communication. And these happen at roll calls, they happen in the field, and they happen on the 10th floor of the police building. And I think that body cameras, like Bobby said, do give some opportunities to look at things that we haven't been able to look at before. But these world events, I mean, a year ago, who knew that we were going to be talking about social distancing and enforcing social distancing and enforcing it the same in Venice Beach as we enforce it in East LA or South LA. There are new challenges, and I think that this process that we are in and these summaries really give us an opportunity to look forward and set the future. And my personal feeling now, again, this is my 7th year, so it's only been 2 chiefs, but you know, I'm a member of the public for a long time. I've never seen more hands-on in specifics than through Chief Moore. And I'll say it again, I believe that Chief Bratton was the right guy at the right time. I believe that Charlie Beck was the right guy at the right time. And I believe that Chief Moore, with his experience and understanding and willingness to get involved in every detail, is absolutely the right person, a blessing for Los Angeles at this time. So again, 3.5 pounds of facts, and how does it make the world better? We'll know in a year. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will, I think, conclude our question. Oh, Chief Moore, did you want to?
I want to take an opportunity to, because I had 6 points on what I found significant in this report, and much have been covered. But
Well,
as
let me ask my final question, and then if we don't cover it, why don't you conclude and wrap up? I did want to ask you and Chief Grimala, because it hasn't come up today, but it was brought up last week by Commissioner Bonner, the impact, disproportionate impact on categorical use of force on what the report refers to, I think on, I didn't write down all the pages, but the chart on suspects, and that it reflects a huge number, almost, I think it's, math is right, 86% impact on communities of color. And certainly I think we all can appreciate how that can undermine confidence in the police department. And so I know you all have been reflecting on that number and analyzing all the issues surrounding it. And while we have to look at each case individually as commissioners, I know Chief Moore, Chief Grimala, Chief Arcos, you've all been analyzing these numbers, looking at them, and determining where do you go from here. And I wonder if you can address that issue again this week. Again, I know we addressed it briefly last week, but it deserves further conversation. So I'm sorry, I can't see who.
well, I'll handle it. I think that's one of the most pressing issues in law enforcement, is the impact we have on law enforcement, that policing has on communities of color, adverse or otherwise. And certainly in use of force here, we see the involvement that we have with people, persons of color, as well as persons experiencing homelessness. And there are disparities. And for instance, in this persons experiencing homelessness, the makeup of that broad definition is wildly disproportionate to, for instance, on Blacks, as it is to their representation in our residential population. And so the numbers of comparison, what we are looking to is that in each instance in which we resort to force, how are the tactics, how are the approach, are we involved in a situation, are we the right persons even to be there? Development that's happened in the last couple of years, for instance, is tactical disengagement, is where we deal with persons experiencing mental illness and people who may pose a danger to themselves. And historically, it's been policing is going to resolve that. And then sometimes that resolution has actually come at where the person and the police action results when we lose their life. We're looking at in policing how in our neighborhoods where we've shifted strategies from crime suppression, uniform presence of Metro and the heavy presence of that to other tactics such as how do we build trust through community safety partnership? How do we circle back with an incident that happened, for instance, in Jesse Owens Park over the weekend involving reports of individuals that were smoking narcotics, but consuming alcohol, potential gang members, and we conduct an investigation. And how do we deal with the public who believes that we're there because people were not socially distanced and not wearing masks, when in reality, an individual was arrested carrying a firearm. There was assaults on an officer who was bit, some other circumstances that resulted in the enforcement action. So our efforts in that instance, for instance, was circle back and have officers, not from an enforcement posture, but from an information posture, provide information in context to why the officers truly were there versus the rumor control. In the disproportionate impact on communities of color in this report, we're also looking at were there instances of family violence? Were there instances in which the criminal justice system failed that family and could have off-ramped and gotten victims and offenders away from what ultimately happened as far as an attack on officers or attack on another family member? We had just a briefing, I'll say, in a few moments on my chief's remarks relative to family violence in the South Los Angeles that resulted in an officer-involved shooting that I'll be talking about briefly. And without judging that shooting, those facts and circumstances that the officers inherited resulted in the shooting of that male Hispanic and 26 years of age. We're always looking at how do we change our path to that, to interrupt it. And are there ways in which we change our tactics? Are there ways in which we change our training and the way we change our expectations? Historically, policing may have said, well, it's, we were shot at 8 of 26 times last year, disproportionately by persons of color. And so that reference is then somehow an implied defense. And while that is true, that reference does have disproportionate people of color that or represent the threat against officers, that doesn't justify our response. Our response has got to be more learned and more studied and more critical about how we can, recognizing this cycle, this syndrome, how do we avoid it? And my commitment as chief, and I know of every member of this organization, is to demonstrate in our word and action that we mean to do just that.
Thank you, Chief. Did you have anything else you wanted to conclude with?
Yeah, I wanted to reference, because Commissioner Soboroff referenced it. I think Chief Grimala may have mentioned it in her notes, but to talk about live, what we're doing now going forward, because this is a lagging indicator, is that the average number of rounds did go up this last year versus the year before. And we were on a back-to-back year of decline. And so we've looked at command and control, we've looked at fire control, we're looking at the number of officers that holster or unholster weapons. But I'm really proud we went back to training division and the staff about 6 months ago and said, how much does our firearms training course influence this? Because our firearms training course has multiple rounds that are fired, and speed and accuracy is a combination of a weighted factor. And so they came back and actually modeled for me and senior staff a training seminar that officers would go to rather than qualifying 3 or 4 times a year on a standard qualification course, which is 2 shots on the left target, 2 shots on the right target, and a headshot on each of those targets. Rather than sequencing that in a timed fashion, let's give them a scenario that's more realistic to what they'll find in the field, and require them to operate as a team, utilize other tools, and fire control is one of the primary measures of their success, not time. And we modeled that. We've actually identified what it would cost in resources and personnel to begin it, and then the pandemic hit us. But I think that it speaks to our very issue of we're willing to break apart any system on any of our training and our tools and pull them back together again and find new ways and trial and experiment to find ways to be successful. And so that is my commitment. I know it's my team's commitment. I'm proud of the work they're doing.
Hey, may I make one quick comment
Yes,
on that? I would say that, yeah, eventually, Chief, I think you're gonna also need to find a way to look beyond your system, right? I mean, so you're addressing, I think, a number of issues that are internal to the workings of policing. And again, the point I'm also coming back to is acknowledging, and I think you do, but just what bears repeating, that you're policing within a broader context of a number of societal issues and systems that historically have proven that they generate the same results. And so we're kind of, we're on that tail end of criminalization of everything, as it was in the 90s, of criminalize everything and lock everybody up as long as possible. And it's going to take some time for that to work itself out of the system, so to speak. But now I think, one way you might look at this going forward is you're doing this 5-year look back. Maybe the department needs to look at setting a goal of looking at the next 5 years and trying to achieve an overall reduction of policing in some of these communities, so that in 5 years' time, you're clear that you're in those communities focused on the most serious things, the most serious threats, and you've got those relationships intact. But hopefully, through influencing and engaging with and participating in the broader conversation about how do we get officers out of the business of arresting and engaging with people who are engaged in relatively minor types of offenses, but may happen to be on parole or may happen to just got out of prison. It's a balance between achieving accountability for criminality on the one hand, which you clearly have to do to keep people safe, but to also realize that some of the autopilot systems, by the way, and that's not the best term, but I'm just saying that you could have everybody doing exactly what they're supposed to do in accordance with policy and still achieving this substandard result. That in a case that wouldn't necessarily be a function of how the department is operating within or without or outside its policies, but just a failure to recognize that you're part of a system that needs some serious adjustment. So I'm just encouraging us to continue the conversation about how you can train officers to do everything they're supposed to do as police officers, but at the same time shepherd the individual officers in the department through a period where there's a growing conversation about the realities around the system that everybody is working within.
Sure.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonner. Seeing no other indicators from commissioners that they wish to speak, Madam Secretary, please close public comment and let me know how many people are in the queue, please.
We have 9 speakers.
Okay, please call the first speaker.
Okay, the first one is Paula Miner.
And
sorry.
let the next 2 to 3 speakers know who's in the queue.
Okay, 1 moment, please. Okay, I have Gina Viola, Hamid Khan, and T. Gina Viola, can you hear me?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Wow, there's so much to unpack here in this report. I want to start by saying I think it's very disingenuous for the media and for you all to have reported all about the big decrease in 2019. I saw many articles about it after last week's presentation, when we know for a fact the numbers are up for 2020. So that's really misleading to the public in general. I just want to say that off the bat. These reports really mean nothing. By the time you present them, it's already dated information. The world we're living in now in 2020 is incredibly different from what you're unpacking here from 2015 through 2019. And even so, Mr. Soboroff, you brought into your comment about social distancing and enforcement of social distancing. And how do you feel that you're doing that equitably? You're not at all. Folks in the West Side are barely being given tisk and handed a mask, while folks in the inner city and East Side are being criminalized and arrested and ticketed and brutalized. I have a question about the report itself. What is a pre-planned use of force? What is that? I noticed there were 2 deaths that were pre-planned uses of force. No one's going to answer that. Okay. What I'd like to hear about in use of force reports is what's done with officers after they've engaged in use of force. How about statistics on that? How many officers receive paid time off after the occurrence? And how much does the city pay out in lawsuits after each occurrence? Can we add some of that into this? That would be.
Thank you. And next speaker, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we have.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
So looking at the report, one of the things is very clear that, as they say, the devil's in the details, that even while there's a whole bunch of flowery conversation about reduced numbers, but on your page 129, 130 of the report, when you do the analysis with the other cities, the continuing trend of LAPD leading the nation as compared to each one of those departments is very much there in shootings, in deaths. So even if it's 12 this year or 2019, it's still the highest in the country. So when we compared with New York NYPD and various other departments too, where the argument is not that the population is more or this, that, and the other, and New York has twice the population of the city of Los Angeles. But then the other piece that also needs to be looked at also is that the non-lethal use of force around the takedowns and the use of batons and everything else has gone up by double digit. And I think this is what brings me to what we have always lifted here at Dale Bonner, is that the conditions on the ground, that we can talk about the garnishing and the superficial levels of where the training is, but the programs are as such which really create conditions where contact is going to be made. You had 1.7 million contacts that were made. Now in those, of course, we have these numbers about takedowns and use of batons too, because inherently the programs are now building towards more speculative and hunch-based policing. Data, that's the devil in the data-driven policing programs, that it assigns criminality. That was the reason why the gang enforcement details, the disparate impact that we are still talking about, the 5-to-1 impact, that people are led to stopping and making contact, which further can escalate. Yes, people who are being killed, the numbers have gone down, but the takedowns, so it's just a matter of time. It's just you're playing, it's a circular conversation that we're having and not digging deep into the impact of the program.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker, please.
Thank you. The next speaker is T.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, first off, there was a lot of information. I'll echo what the first 2 people had to say to try to, come back and comment all the information given in 2 minutes. So I'm going to do the best of my ability. First off, I wish that the department would see people as human beings. You have this desensitized way of, going about these presentations, and people's lives are turning them into graphs and charts and presentations, and this dehumanization of people's lives that you're taking. These are families that are left torn apart, permanently separated. And you're going about this like it's a nonchalant thing, that people's lives are, there's no regard for life. I'm going to go on to say about you're treating people also as suspects that are actually victims on your presentation. They should be accounted for as a victim once they've been killed. And then you mentioned accountability, and as Gina had talked about, what is the aftermath? There's Kershario Mack, who you opened fire, that was having a mental crisis, you killed, was found out of policy, and officers Martin Robles, and Ryan Lee have not been fired. What are the protocols for these officers and the accountability? And then you talk about training, yet how do you train people? You're continually hiring people that are racist. They're inherently racist. And so how do you unteach racism within the department and the disparity of how people are being approached on the south side compared to other parts of the city?
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next three speakers, Paula Miner, T, and Sherry Varon. I apologize. Paula Miner, Sherry Varon, and Adam Smith. Paula Miner?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. First of all, this is probably one of the most senseless and absurd reports the LAPD has to put together. You shouldn't even have to have a use of force report. This report, it tells us how LAPD has been able to kill or seriously brutalize the citizens, especially Black, brown, poor, and homeless citizens. The report continues to show that LAPD and LASD continue to lead the nation in killing its citizens. And LAPD receives more than 50% of the city's budget and constantly begs for donations from the LA Police Foundation for operational costs. The creation of this 400-page document with excessive photos, with language bragging, filled with sanitizing, changing words into acceptable format, and defending this use of force is an extreme waste. We know that the only reason there has been a decrease over the years isn't because of LAPD, but because of community pressure, because of families reliving their trauma, because we held LAPD accountable, because we went to Sacramento and worked with our legislature to change laws, because we demand something different, and we will continue to do so. LAPD has got to stop this state-sanctioned violence against the people. They must begin to hold officers accountable and not waste funds producing an extravagant, expensive PR document designed to justify the use of force. And of course, you can begin immediately by firing those officers whose actions were found out of policy in this commission, and you know who they are. This has got to change. This is not a pat on the back for LAPD.
Thank you. And I neglected also, we had some written comments submitted before this meeting on this item, and I'll have those read at the end. So apologies for that. Our next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Sherry Varon.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, well, I agree with everything that everybody said, and I also would like to have statistics on what happens to officers after the incidents. And one of the things, I know social workers need to have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. They need to take a licensing exam and go under supervision. The other thing that hits me is police, social work is a helping profession, and they go into it with a helping, wanting to help. Policing is a control issue. And different people that have spoken about being in jails have talked about how no one has ever come up to them and asked, you know, what can we do to help you? So policing is not a helping profession. And I think part of the problem is that's part of the culture. It's a control issue, and the attitudes are very different than a social worker going into situations. And that's all I have to. Oh, also, they are not officer-involved shootings. They are officers shooting in, you know, not shootings. Thank you. That's all.
The next speaker, Adam Smith.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Great. Chief Grimala stated that all quote-unquote suspects were male. I'm wondering if the new LAPD, the LAPD that cares so much about the LGBTQIA community, according to Chief Grimala's own role in the department, I wonder if before the LAPD shoots people, before they shoot and murder Black and brown people, are you really finding out how they identify their gender? I'm not making this point as some kind of joke or fleeting reference to political correctness. I'm making it because the violence inherent to this police force is so systemic, so built into a system of, you know, white supremacist, cis hetero-ness, that even in death, even when community members' lives are stolen, they have to fit into a box, figuratively and literally. I have to wonder aloud, Chief Grimala, is this how you saw your career going? Did you join the LAPD to use this type of language to normalize and excuse violence and death? You can make excuses about this type of sterile language you use when discussing data, but that's truly how you see the community, as data sets and data points meant to be manipulated and controlled. What the hell is an application? From my vantage point, you apply for a job. You apply aloe to a sunburn. You don't apply a taser to a human being. You actually use the words baton application. Yeah, LT, I unfortunately had to apply my baton to the skull of that woman today. Yeah, Captain, I sure have been applying my 40mm grenade launcher a lot lately. In fact, I applied that grenade straight to the chest of a homeless person earlier today, but don't worry, I didn't perceive a mental health issue. Mr. Bonner, you seem to be one voice that seems to react with decency after some of these presentations, but I find your framing of those who have been on the receiving end of LAPD violence as lost their way incredibly shameful. Is it not Frank Hernandez and Frank Martinez and Eden Medina and Martin Robles and Ryan Lee? Aren't they the ones that have lost their way?
Thank you. The next three speakers, Isaac Fairfield, Baba Akili, and Jamie Garcia. One moment, please. Okay. At this time, I'm going to call Baba Akili.
Yes, I want to echo Adam's last comment. Gashario Mack didn't lose his way. Eric Rivera didn't lose his way. Waukesha Wilson didn't lose their way. So that's a poor way to justify or to connect what happened to people who were killed having committed no crime and done nothing wrong. The other thing I want to raise up, for the past 35 years, I've heard good, decent white people say and report on disproportionate impact that's happening to Black people. And then they don't just simply follow it by saying, because of racism. That's why it's disproportionate. So if we're going to talk about disproportionate impact to Black people, then we should also talk about anti-Blackness and racism. And then finally, I think we need to, if you want to reduce the number of the incidences, we need to have some real accountability. I think people have referenced this before, but if you get ruled out of policy and of a killing, like in the case of Gashario Mack, and all you get is training, or that was recommended, or in the case when Ezell Ford was killed and that the stop was ruled out of policy and Chief Beck decides to go on the video and say to the force, I got your back, that sends a message that there's no accountability, there's no responsibility, and there's no consequence to killing us. And that's why the numbers continue to keep LA in the top 5 police departments around the country that kill their citizens, disproportionately killing Black people. So if we had more accountability and we recognize and accepted that the police force is anti-Black and is a racist institution, maybe we could reduce some of this killing.
Thank you. The next speaker, Jamie Garcia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so I'm going to play the data game and list some data from Christiane Williams in the book, Our Enemies in Blue. So in 2005, it was stated that 19 million Americans experienced direct face-to-face contact with police. Nearly 1 million of those contacts were force or threat of force. So 57,000 officers during that same time were assaulted in their work. 80% by unarmed people, 77% received no injury at all. So basically, with this data, police use violence 9 times as often as they face violence, right? So fatalities, in 2003 to 2005, 380 police died, right? 159 by homicide, 221 by accident. During that same time, 1,095 people were killed by police during the process of arrest. So you're looking at one person per day, but now we know because of community-based work, we're looking at one person almost 7 hours and 30 minutes. So police use violence more often at higher levels and with deadlier effects. Now more, you want to claim it's just because of a few bad apples, right? We've heard the few bad apples. You have your teams, you have your people that are supposed to check out and find these bad apples right before they do something. But this is institutional, this is structural, this is based on practices, this is based on your social role, this is how you push blame. And basically, let's go back to Laser, because Laser was in effect for 10 years, even post the consent decree being lifted. We had supervisors signing off on people being tracked, traced, and stalked and arbitrarily put on lists with no recourse and no investigation into what actually happened to them. So police see the public as the enemy, as tumors, as savages, as domestic terrorists. And you specifically think that offender-based tactics of surveilling and tracking people will actually bring some kind of peace to the community. This is pure before the bullet hits the body.
Thank you. Was that our last speaker?
We have one more. We have Isaac Fairfield. One moment. One moment, please.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning. As the lady said, I go by Isaac Matthews Fairfield, and I'm a poet and a political satirist based in London, England. I'm thankful to be able to listen to the discussion from across the pond, isn't it? I'll be quick, but I'm just wondering, is it this body's assertion that you can train your way out of all the beating and killing inherent to your system of policing? How many bodies is excusable? Again, I'm thankful to be able to listen in here. And special thanks to you, Mum, Ms. Decker, for facilitating such a contentious meeting of critics and jokesters. And I wouldn't be I.M. Farfield if I didn't say that Steve seems like a petulant little baby, isn't it? God save the Queen.
Okay, you've gone far afield, and I don't believe you are who you say, which is perfectly your choice, but you've gone far afield, and your time is now deemed up. Please remove that person from queue, and let's move forward. That was the last speaker, Madam Secretary, correct?
Yes, correct.
All right, Mr. Teefank, we had some written comments provided. Could you please summarize them? I believe there were 4 or 5 on this item, I'm not sure. They were distributed to all of the commissioners in advance. We all had the opportunity to read them, but for the record, Mr. Teefank, could you please provide those?
Sure, Commissioner Decker. The comments were received. There were 4 comments on this item. They're generally the same, so I will read one of them, and I think it encapsulates all of the comments. LAPD shouldn't even have a use of force report. That is already an indication of failure. This report shows that LAPD and LASD continue to lead the nation in killing, brutalizing, and harming the citizens of LA, especially Black, brown, and homeless people. LAPD receives more than 50% of the city's budget and constantly seeks donations from the LA Police Foundation for operational costs. The creation of this 400-page document with excessive color, publicity, photos, and language bragging and defending this use of force is an extreme waste of resources. LAPD must stop this state-sanctioned violence against the citizens of LA. LAPD must hold the officers who commit the described use of force accountable and not waste funds producing an extravagant, expensive PR document designed to justify the use of force. Begin immediately by firing the officers who murdered Grishario Mack and the officer who murdered Albert Ramon Dorsey, all of whom were found out of policy by this commission. Fire Martin Robles, Ryan Lee, and Edward Agdepa. We know that the only reason there has been a decrease over the years isn't because of you, but because of community pressure, because of families reliving their trauma, because we hold you accountable, because we change laws, because we demand something different, and we will continue to do so week after week. And that summarizes the comments of all four of them.
Thank you, Mr. Tiefenk. That concludes this item on the agenda, regular agenda item 1A. No action is requested of the Board of Police Commissioners. We'll move on to then item 1B, which is the department's report relative to a transmittal of a grant application. This is a grant application to improve the quality and timeliness and efficiency of forensic services that is being provided by the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Members of the Commission, do you have any questions on this item? Seeing no, all heads shaking, and I don't have any questions, let's close the queue for public comment. Madam Secretary, are there any public comments, people in queue?
We had one. We have none at this time.
Okay, very well. Then I will move the matter. The request is to approve the department's report and transmit concurrently to the mayor and the city council. I will move that forward. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Soberoff seconded. Please unmute your microphone so we can take a verbal vote. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, the matter passes 3-0. The next matter on our agenda is item 1C. This is the Executive Director's Report relative to adjustment for fees for special services. As you know, at the end of every fiscal year, we are required to pass on to the Chief Administrative Officer or sometimes the council different information on fees. I understand, Mr. Tiefenk, this is the last one we will be considering this year. Is that right?
Yes, Madam President.
And can you just briefly describe what this is before we move forward?
Sure. These are special services fees, and under the administrative code, they're established on on a fiscal year basis by the Board of Police Commissioners. There are 5 different types of fees: arrest and crime reports, traffic report, clearance detention letters, criminal-related summaries, and photographs that are placed on a CD. There are very minor increases this year. Arrest crime reports are going from $26 to $27. A traffic report from $17 to $18. Clearance detention letters from $34 to $35. Criminal record summaries are set by the state of California at a maximum of $25, and that is the fee we charge. And photographs per CD are for $5. And those fees are established using the wages of the involved employees who process those requests, along with the cap rate or the benefit rate for each of the employees. And that concludes the report.
So in other words, it's a formulaic determination that we have to present. At least that's my understanding.
Yes.
Questions from commissioners?
No.
Ms. Bonner, okay. Are there, let's close public comment on this item. Madam Secretary, is there anyone in queue?
We have no speakers.
All right, then I will move the matter forward to approve the Executive Director's report and transmit to the City Administrative Officer for informational purposes only. Is there a second?
Second.
Soberoff, second. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? The matter passes 3-0. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is 1D. This is a non-monetary donation from the Los Angeles Police Commission in the value of $350,000.
Foundation, from the foundation, you mean?
Los Angeles Police Foundation, thank you, in the value of $350,000 to be utilized for recruitment, marketing for diversity, for the benefit of Personnel Group. This matter, obviously, due to its size, will have to go to the Mayor and City Council to be accepted. We heard a few weeks ago a presentation on recruitment, but nevertheless, are there questions from commissioners on this item?
My only question is to confirm that some months ago, I believe we had a report, a more substantive report on the grant was forthcoming, and we walked through how it was going to be utilized. So I'm just confirming it's the same issue.
That's my understanding, but Chief Moore, can you, is that right, sir?
I believe we should have Chief Grimala on the available for this, but I believe there's a shift given the utility of our cadet management software versus the use of marketing money. So I'll look to Chief Grimala if she's available.
Yes, Chief Grimala, I see you've joined us.
And it should be explained in the body of the report as well.
Chief, we have some questions on items, regular agenda items 1D. This is the non-monetary donation from the Los Angeles Police Foundation for $350,000. We've reviewed the materials, but we have some questions. This is for recruitment marketing for diversity. And so we just want to be sure we understand the specifics of that. Chief?
Yes, and the question was, what is this, where is the source, or?
No. I'm just clarifying that some months ago we had at a prior board meeting, we had a presentation and a discussion about the going forward plans to do some additional marketing for recruiting. And I'm just wanting to confirm whether this is now the execution of the strategy that had been discussed some months ago and that was touched on, I think, last week. It seems to me to be part of the same plan, and just confirming that it is.
Yes, Mr. Bonner, thank you. I'm sorry, I was off the screen. Yes, it is a confirmation of that, exact thing.
Excellent, thank you.
And I stand corrected that this is for the diversity planning for African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Asian Pacific Islanders and women,
Yes,
according to the report.
And women.
The threefold process. Yes, it is.
Yes.
Terrific.
Thank you, Mr. Bonner. Ms. Decker.
Thank
No,
you.
that's fine. Thank you so much. And I just want to be sure, are there any other questions of commissioners? Seeing none, let's close public comment. Madam Secretary, are there people in queue on this item?
Yes, we have 4. We have Adam Smith, T, Zach Sherwin, and Gina Viola. The first is Adam Smith.
Yeah, so I don't think you really answered the question. You said it's non-monetary, but it also said it's funding the hiring of like consultants and stuff. So which is it? How much of it is going to go to Breitbart? And, you know, we just listened to this fucking 2.5 hours of bullshit about use of force, and you're patting yourselves on the back about the, you know, number of black officers matches the percentage of black folks in the population of Los Angeles, and you still disproportionately kill black people. So diversity hiring doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't, it'll never matter the race or ethnicity of your officers. To use your own language, the application of state violence is inherently white supremacist. The application of your tasers, of your bullets, your batons, your bolo wraps, your beatings, they're inherently black. Shame on all of you for doing this with your fucking day. And shame on you for thinking that truly thinking that diversity is gonna stop the inherent anti-black nature of the LAPD. Far afield this.
I just said.
Next speaker, please.
Thank you. The next speaker is T.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so all your reporting is deeply disturbing. And the fact that you continually ask for money and you're already receiving 50% of the city's budget, and you continue to fundraise and source money and resources and pull resources that are actually needed for the community. You're continually asking for money and funding, and it's disproportionately going into the killing of Black, Brown, Indigenous people and the harassment of the communities and terrorizing the communities. How about saying no to some of that money and putting it into mental health, into affordable housing, into food security, into marginalized and underserved communities? These same communities that you're getting funding to terrorize and kill in, that same money you're taking from the community could actually go into help building the communities, right? We have what, 60,000 homeless here? Y'all pretended like you were going to shelter them during COVID-19, and you have these vacant hotels on top of it, and I'm seeing homeless people everywhere. So I'm not really sure what your definition of assistance is, but you're saying one thing and doing another, and it's propaganda. So you're promoting it on the media that you're actually helping the community, and all your presentations promote and advocate that you're helping the community when you're actually terrorizing and killing the community. So how about taking some of that money and putting it back into the community instead of over policing and terrorizing us. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker, Zach Sherwin.
Yeah, I also want to speak to that confusing language in which it says in the recommended action that it's a non-monetary donation, and then throughout the document it seems like unambiguously that it is a monetary donation. I don't feel like if there was questioning and explanation of that discrepancy, then it didn't really clear it up for me. And I mean, even in the best case scenario, it's kind of like sloppy reporting or report writing, and I'm curious what's going on there. This stuff about like, you know, the 3 categories of quote unquote African Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, and women, just like these are like these 3 boxes you need to check off your list of hires to make so that you can have some cover for when you do the kind of shit that you did just spend 2 hours and 10 minutes once public comment started talking about in the use of force report. I don't know. It just is, it's gross to hear about, and it's gross. Commissioner Decker's Freudian slip of calling the LA Police Foundation the LA Police Commission was an interesting little moment for me. I feel like it might as well be the same the way you guys approve all these donations. And finally, as I consider this donation that is going to enrich the LAPD, I can't help but think of the phrase "God enriches," which is the official state motto of the state of Arizona. And Chief Moore, I just thought you might be interested in that little bit of trivia. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you. The last speaker, Gina Viola.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So yeah, I too want to speak to the $350,000 donation in the middle of a public health and economic crisis is just really, it's more of the LAPD sucking away very vital funds for the rest of the city. And the fact that you have to hire consultants to the tune of $350,000 in one of the most diverse cities in the world to make your department more diverse speaks to the systemic problem you have. It really does. And that's what you should be addressing, not hiring a high-priced consultant to color the police force or female up the police force. I shake my head at it all, and I don't understand. I just don't understand. I think you should reject this donation, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you. And we have no other speakers on this item.
Thank you very much. And with respect to the monetary, non-monetary donation, this is because the foundation is engaging the vendor directly. The money's not coming through the Los Angeles Police Department, but the Los Angeles Police Department is the beneficiary of the donation. So it's considered, my understanding, that makes it considered non-monetary. Mr. Tiefenk, or to the city attorney, if I have that wrong, please correct me. But hopefully that clarifies any confusion on that item. With respect to the board recommended action, the request is to receive the department's report and transmit to the mayor and city council for acceptance. I will move that forward. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Soberoff. If everyone can unmute for the vote. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, and there are no abstentions. It passes 3-0. Moving on to regular agenda item 1E, the department's report relative to various donations from the Los Angeles Police Foundation. Members of the commission, does anybody have any questions on item E? Seeing no hands, we'll close public comment. Madam Secretary, are there any cards on this item?
We have 2. We have Gina Viola and Adam Smith.
Thank you.
Gina Viola.
Gina Viola? Madam Secretary, is there a problem with bringing her?
She's not unmuting.
Okay.
Looks like me.
Let's move on to the next speaker and then we'll try her again just to be sure.
Adam Smith, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
This might be my last comment. My spouse is talking so much, I gotta break quarantine and drive to Arizona and get my nails done. But I'm just wondering, like, do all of you commissioners actually know what all of these donations are going for? I know Steve reads everything, and I believe him because he says it with his words. But it's why aren't these their own separate things? Why are they all one thing that we're supposed to speak on in 2 minutes? Shit is bullshit.
All right, I assume that's the conclusion of his remarks.
It's not. I'm still talking.
Okay, we didn't hear anything. Please proceed.
Okay, now I'm done.
Madam Secretary, can you see if Ms. Viola, if Gina Viola wishes to speak or not, if she's still in queue?
Gina Viola, please.
All right, I assume she needed to move on and is not interested in speaking on this item, so we'll proceed then. The recommended board action is to approve the department's report and accept the donations. I'll move that matter forward. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Soborov seconds. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
That was a yes vote, correct, Mr. Soborov?
Yes.
All opposed? Okay, abstentions, it passes 3-0. Thank you very much. We'll move on then to the Chief of Chief.
Good morning, Commissioners. Actually, good afternoon. Yeah. So I'm going to address, as I do, significant events, including any officer-involved shootings. And I want to report on, I referenced it briefly in my earlier remarks, but in Southeast Division on the 14th of May at approximately 1:13 in the afternoon, in the 700 block of West 123rd Street, which is the Southeast area, those patrol officers responded to a radio call of shots being fired. A person was nearby and called on behalf of her neighbor, who the neighbor advised that her son had a gun and was attempting to kill the neighbor's daughter. Upon arrival, the officer set up a containment on the location and made contact with an individual later identified as Anthony Isaac, male, Hispanic, 26 years of age. They contacted him over the phone, and the officers determined that he was armed with by the officer's account, armed with a gun and had shot a round at a door inside the location and would not let his sister exit the location. Anthony Isaac eventually did exit that location and reportedly was armed with a revolver, and an officer-involved shooting occurred. He was struck by the gunfire and succumbed to his injuries at the scene. A loaded revolver was recovered at the scene. No officers were injured during this incident. Force Investigation Division personnel did respond to the scene, as did the District Attorney's officer-involved shooting rollout team, as well as the Office of the Inspector General. A couple other matters I want to discuss is and bring to the Commission's attention is this past Friday, Federal Judge Carter, who has been working with the city and county leadership, public leadership, as well as with plaintiffs involving various issues involving persons experiencing homelessness. On this past Friday, he issued an order for LA County and LA City officials that would require us to move persons experiencing homelessness from living areas near freeways, citing significant health and safety concerns. The order was stayed pending its effect, which would be this Friday. And the city and county were provided opportunities for senior representatives to provide a counter offer to the judge's order. That offer was due today, and I look forward to working in partnership with our city and county representatives in understanding the counter proposal, as well as with all the parties involving any eventual order by the judge or any impact on policing or persons experiencing homelessness that are sheltering currently underneath freeway overpasses and adjacent to freeway property. The other matter I wanted to talk about just briefly was this past Saturday, just a catastrophic fire that the world, we all recognized and took our breath, resulting in the injuries of 12 firefighters in the downtown area. The immediate aftermath of that report, I reached out to Chief Terrazas, and our department responded fully in support of the emergency response of firefighters, as well as supporting the evacuation of those injured firefighters, as well as sent our investigative resources from Robbery Homicide Division and Major Crimes. Major Crimes will now stay alongside LA Fire Department arson investigators. And yesterday, with the arrival of the National Response Team of ATF, become part of a unified command to investigate the cause and origin of that fire. I'm thankful to report that of the 12 firefighters that were initially transported and rushed to a nearby hospital and admitted, some of them, 4 were incubated, that all of them have progressed well, and we're down to just, as of yesterday afternoon, only 4 remaining in the hospital. All are expected to make a recovery from these life-threatening injuries. However, I'm sure that there'll be many lasting scars and impacts on them. We have, we'll continue, I'm working with Chief Terrazas. We talk daily to ensure that anything we can offer from our department in support of our partners in public safety, including our behavioral service science section psych personnel, that can help debrief and help support family members and others that have been impacted by this tragic event. As to yesterday afternoon, I sat with Chief Terrazas and we received a very detailed brief of where the investigation has gone to date. And while I can't discuss the details of that investigation, I will say that there is an expansive area around the initial fire location, an effort to recover evidence from this horrific event. And I look forward to, in the weeks and months ahead, to the thoroughness of a NRT type investigation. We as a department have worked with them recently in regards to a series of downtown fires involving large apartment complexes, as well as in other events, including a series of arson fires in the city that occurred in 2012. Those, our partners in ATF are absolute professionals, best in their breed in extensive forensic level investigative efforts to, and I'm sure they'll get to a thorough understanding of what led to this event. Second is yesterday we submitted to the mayor and to Office of the Emergency Management Department our initial steps of our reconstitution plan, dealing with guidance and direction for ensuring an effective transition from our present operations during this pandemic to staged reopening that we see regarding essential and non-essential activities, as well as businesses here in Los Angeles. I've briefed the commission earlier about our joint engagement with the county partners, as well as all the city family as we go through this ordeal. And yesterday was a turning point where we've now identified in draft form the next 2 phases of this recovery or reconstitution effort. And I'll be happy to share with commissioners that document. We will be looking for feedback from our emergency management department and our city team as we make adjustments or already gaining their insight as to the various aspects. And in short, what the plan will provide for is the way the department operates as we are today, with some 422 mobilized officers providing shelter support, testing sites, and other COVID-related matters. As those sites are eventually closed and as the testing is discontinued, we'll see ourselves transitioning into more typical operations. And that operations will likely coexist about the same time or later that we see a broadening of the relaxation of the safer at home order relative to activities that occur across our communities. So this is a plan that memorializes how we'll restore and what front desk services will look like, what will happen when officers who are currently on COVID-related matters return back to specialized detectives. And it also identified some of the things that we're observing and learning from this pandemic as to alternate services plans and means of which policing in our city as they've been adversely impacted, but what do we learn for opportunities for community engagement, for community policing, and as well as the utilization of our personnel. And we began mapping some of that out. Last aspect of the plan is to identify the health and safety measures that will be taken both for the public as well as police personnel, because we know that in the next phase of this reconstitution, that the threat of this pandemic will continue, and that added safeguards such as face coverings and sanitation and hygiene will be our new normal for the foreseeable future. So again, this is a good sign in our 10th week, 9th to 10th week of this pandemic, that as we see in the last 2 weeks, opening up of other portions of our city and activities, the beaches and the trailheads and parks and other businesses themselves, the department is staying tightly looped in the planning circle to stay ahead of the development of this emergency and its eventual exit from it. Lastly, in regards to employee wellness in the pandemic, as I report each week, this past week, we, as of this morning, have 112 of our personnel that are COVID positive. That is an increase of only 4 from last week, which is a encouragement of seeing that number slow. You may recall last week we had a sizable jump of, I believe, about 15 personnel. So with this, though, was kind of the counterbalance of that was this past week, we saw the number of employees at home due to COVID exposure rise to 146. Previously, that number was 125. So that's 21 additional personnel. What we have in the mix here is, while a number of 65 personnel have returned back full duty from a COVID exposure, the number that are pending test results is what is making up that added number of quarantined and employees that are staying at home pending those results. We're working very closely with the testing centers through our medical liaison and personnel department to understand the results of those tests so that we can, should we find officers that are testing negative, can return them to work, and if they're positive, to ensure that they are isolating and are getting necessary treatment. Currently, we've tested more than 1,300 of our employees for possible COVID exposure. And at this point, less than 10% are returning positive for this virus. So it is a deceptive one in that both, whether it be asymptomatic or a person exhibiting flu-like symptoms and so forth, in both instances, one will test positive who's asymptomatic, and other individuals who are experiencing respiratory issues, believing they have COVID, will in fact be found negative and just experiencing a common cold or flu. But the dynamics of that is that with the increase that we did see Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, this goes to Commissioner Bronner's issue about kind of having a finger on the pulse. We saw that increase suddenly of those 14, 15 additional people. And we said we need to reissue our guidance to our personnel relative to the use of PPEs and masks and face coverings and so forth. This is we still have challenges before us. But as we're seeing in the county, the height of this pandemic and the numbers are beginning to flatten. We've seen some decreases. I'm encouraged by that within the organization as well. Moving over to our crime picture. Again, Commissioner Bonner, thank you for being on the call yesterday. Sorry for some of the logistics relative to getting our teams up on the screen, but what we are seeing is a reduced impact of what we initially saw with COVID. The COVID event pandemic was a peace dividend, if you will, a reduction in serious crime, particularly violent crime. And during much of the month of March, it began to decrease a bit in April. And then, of course, the last 2 weeks, I've reported to a surge in gang violence and gang-related violence, street violence, that was particularly in South Los Angeles. I'm thankful this last week was we saw some reduction in the frequency of shooting violence, particularly in South Los Angeles. And overall, we stand at a 9.2% reduction in violent crime, a 9.8% reduction in Part 1 crime. And we're monitoring closely, again, some issues of gang violence going back and forth, particularly in South Los Angeles and in the Hollenberg area, the East LA portion of the city. And then the other two major components are commercial burglaries and our grand theft autos. The public can help us with those last two areas, particularly in locking, securing residents, commercial establishments, ensuring they have effective alarms and active alarms. And then on the theft of vehicles is to lock and secure those vehicles. To the older model vehicles, those are ready targets for individuals who are frequently stealing those. And a number of our area stations have worked with community organizations and enterprises that are donating anti-theft devices. And so if anyone is interested in those type of matters, they have an older vehicle car, I'm talking Honda, Civic, or Toyota, makes of vehicles that are in years of vehicles that occur in the 90s and early 2000s. Those are frequently targeted, and those anti-theft devices can help prove as a deterrent. Relative to in-custody deaths, we remain at 1 in-custody death this year versus 2 from last year, which is also our 4-year average. This year we have had 10 with this last report, 10 officer-involved shootings. That number was 7 last year, and our 13-year average, I'm sorry, 4-year average is just over 13. We remain at 4 fatal officer-involved shootings this year, 4 fatal last year. That our 4-year average is just under 6, and that concludes my remarks there. As to our traffic collision, last Thursday, as I spoke last week, we had our press conference and outreach and engagement on encouraging the public to slow down, to honor the speed laws, and to recognize with people on the street, pedestrians and others, that we need them to act in a more responsible fashion. I appreciate the leadership of Deputy Chief Chow and others that brought to the public attention relative to these circumstances. We still are experiencing a reduction in serious injury and death collisions, just under 14% year to date. That is a back-to-back-to-back year reduction. And the same occurs with our DUI related collisions, which are down 35% for serious injury and death collisions and nearly 13% for overall DUIs. So these are attributes of less people on the road. However, again, we saw that reduction at a higher rate weeks ago, and now these rates are beginning to diminish. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to slow down and to watch the rules of the road and to get home safely. Moving through this, my last section is on the personnel and civilian staffing, and we are at 9,985 sworn members of this organization. We are at 3,046 civilian members, and we have 389 reserves and 1,724 cadets. And part of our reconstitution plan also preliminarily discussed anticipated furloughs involving our civilian employees. And the department is currently in the process of a civilian position by position to understand what the proposed furloughs in the mayor's budget for fiscal year 2021 will mean as to service curtailments or restrictions or elimination. I'll have more information for the commission in the coming weeks on that as the council deliberates a very, very, very tough budgetary season. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Are there questions from commissioners? No, I see no questions. Let's close the queue for public comment. Madam Secretary, open public comment. How many, excuse me, how many people are in queue for a public comment?
6 speakers. The first 3, Adam Smith, Zach Sherwin, and Paula Miner.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Great. Chief, I'm not going to make jokes about your family traveling out of state. I come to these meetings because of the issues I have with policing and your police force, not the fact that your wife apparently doesn't have to adhere to the county guidelines that you continue to echo to us. Plus, if I spoke about the issues I have...
You're off topic. That is not a matter within the jurisdiction. If you want to talk about the substance of the matters, please proceed.
Jeez, friggin' Captain Far Afield over here. Give me a break. What I do take issue with, because, yeah, if I spoke about the issues I have with all the rich, out-of-touch white people in LA, I'd probably end up talking as much as you do. Anyway, what I do take issue with is this idea that the LAPD is showing up in different communities in an equal way, said so ineloquently by Mr. Soboroff earlier. Your officers literally laughed about people sunbathing in Marina del Rey and Venice the other day while they were brutalizing and beating the shit out of Black folks in Jesse Owens Park and not wearing masks. I saw a protest on Facebook outside of your house, I guess, that you came out to patronize these people and tell them all the rules that they were breaking. You weren't wearing a mask. The cop on your shoulder wasn't wearing a mask. Ooh, I think I just missed a sigh by Steve. He must have his microphone off.
Are you done?
Excuse me?
Are you done with your comments?
I don't know.
All right, let's move on to the next speaker, please.
Oh, whoa.
Next speaker, please.
Next speaker, Zach Sherwin.
Yes, I just want to continue to report that I saw police officers all week with their masks off, standing less than 6 feet apart from each other and driving around together in cop cars without wearing masks. And I'm really alarmed to see this behavior from the coppers on the force. And copper, by the way, is the official medal of the state of Arizona. I saw that Robin Abkarian of the LA Times tweeted over the weekend about 3 LAPD officers looking at sunbathers who, were violating the mayor's order and asking if they'd given citations. And one of the cops laughed and said, no, that would be unconstitutional, like forcing people to wear masks. And she went on, this is the second officer who has told me point blank that they will not be issuing any citations for violating the mayor's orders. And I thought that was pretty interesting and the kind of thing that I would really feel good as a citizen to see the chief of my police force remarking on when he's got an opportunity to talk about what's going on with the police that he's in charge of in the city. I saw another video of some cops at a Chipotle in Baldwin Hills, and an employee asked if they had masks, and they said, no, ma'am, we come into contact with nasty stuff every day, saying, so we don't wear masks. And Chief, I'd be happy to share the link to that if you'd like. I saw you make a face of, I don't understand what you're talking about. So nasty stuff every day. And I wonder if the things they encounter are as nasty as the ridge-nosed rattlesnake, the official state reptile of Arizona. And with that, I am out like an Apache trout.
Thank you. The next speaker, Paula Miner.
Yeah, I also want to comment, since usually the chief's remarks allow us to comment on incidents that have happened in the past week with the action of Jesse Owens Park, where police did end up breaking up what was supposed to be a party in the park. They did end up with 6 arrests. They did come with their explanations afterwards. They said they had to arrest the people because one was a gang member, because they found out he was a gang member when they approached him, apprehended him, put his name in our faulty gang database. They said 3 other people had to be arrested for resisting arrest. That is extremely confusing. Like, if you come up to me and say, I'm going to arrest you, and I say, no, don't arrest me. And they say, oh, I'm going to arrest you for resisting arrest, without explaining to me why I'm being arrested. When the observation is between 15 and 20 officers with no mask, no gloves, approach these people. Of course, the people are going to say, we're here partying. We didn't know that we couldn't party in Jesse Owens Park. We should have taken our party to the beach. And in a time where organizations and individuals, including public defenders, including advocates of the court, are asking that people be released from jail because of the threat of COVID-19, these officers instead are putting people in jail for minor, non-violent offenses, for things that if they really felt they were that serious, they can be held over until this, pandemic is over. So they're putting them in jail when we're trying to make sure people get out of jail, because the jails are where we have an extremely high rate of COVID-19. So Chief Moore continues to say one thing here and something else really happens on the street in reality.
Madam Chair, if I might.
Chief, let's finish hearing public
Okay,
comment
very well.
in entirety. I'm sorry, who's the next speaker, please?
The next 3 speakers, Gina Viola, caller ending in 1403 and T. Gina Viola?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is you've tested 1,300 of more than 9,000 officers. That doesn't make sense to me. The County of LA has stated that everyone in LA can have a test. So I'm wondering why the lion's share of your force has not been tested yet. That's a large number of people still untested that you have out and about. And as we've heard from several people already on the call who are not wearing masks and probably further infecting people. You talk about closely scrutinizing officers that use excessive force or shoot civilians, but when those officers are found out of policy, you don't do anything about that. You don't fire those officers. The officers who killed Grishario Mack and then were found out of policy, you don't do anything about. So I don't know where your close scrutiny stops. Like what does it really do? You're saying there's a surge in gang violence. How do you know it was gang violence? Is it because you're referring to the gang databases that we already know are full of false identifications that have a bunch of faulty information in it? Also, 10 civilians killed by LAPD this year, with 9 weeks of it in stay-at-home orders. This should be your first order of business. This should be your biggest concern. Your department is out of control. You've had more LAPD violence than we've had civilian violence. You have officers shooting each other. I also have to bring up again the disparity between the way the communities are being treated. How folks are being treated in Venice Beach is very different from how they're being treated in South Central or in East LA. And you can speak to it all you like, but the evidence is there. We're seeing video after video of folks being criminalized and brutalized in Black and brown neighborhoods, and white neighborhoods being completely ignored.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
The next speaker is the caller ending in 1403.
Yes, back again. We had a car arson on the 800 block of South Coronado between 8th Street and James M. Woods. This is the second one in a row in 3 weeks. What's Chief Moore doing about this? I think we have an arsonist in that area. Then on the other side of the street, 830 South Hoover on the 2nd floor, we have a prostitution ring. And the cops get called, they come by, and they leave. Why? I don't know. Maybe Chief Moore knows. Now regarding my hero, Judge David O. Carter, Vietnam veteran, longtime friend. See, I drove out to Santa Ana in my little Jeep a couple of months ago to the Santa Ana courthouse, the Reagan building, and I says, we need help. And the next thing you know, he's here in Los Angeles. Thank you, David Carter, for getting rid of problems. Now, the following areas have homeless criminals living underneath them. Burbank, under the 101, and Havenhurst. The 110 freeway, underneath South Hoover, and the favorite, Burbank Boulevard, off of Reseda Boulevard. 29 people living underneath that freeway pass, terrorizing the neighborhood of Tarzana. So if we could get out there today and put them up at the JW Marriott per Judge Carter's order, I would really appreciate it. Now,
Thank you. And the final speaker, T.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so this double standard can't work. On one side, you have this continuous propaganda machine coming from the LAPD with misinformation dispatched to the community. You're professing through the media and on your commission meetings Tuesday what you're doing. In fact, you're doing just the opposite. Everything you say you're doing good for the community is actually the opposite, especially when it comes to Black and brown folks. What, in the first presentation, the other chief mentioned that 34 homeless people were killed. Under what condition is you going in? And first of all, the LAPD is not a social service worker. You're not a mental health worker. You're not a housing authority. You're none of these. It's not part of your job description, right? And the way you're actually helping people with mental problems and homelessness, and if you happen to be Black and brown or on the south or the east side, is they're being killed, they're being over-policed in these communities, right? So there's zero accountability when it comes to these instances. Zero. You say, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that. Grosario Mac, these officers still on the job. They haven't been fired yet. I don't understand. And you said that you're here helping people and you're arresting people still. Further impact in the jail system, right? Where's the testing at in the jails?
Thank you. Madam Secretary, was that?
Yes, that was the final speaker on that item.
Okay, I apologize. I didn't realize that was the final speaker until I looked at the count. So are there people in queue now for general public comment?
Yes, we have.
Chief had something you wanted to say.
Oh, thank you for reminding me, Commissioner Soboroff. Chief, did you want to make any comments? I thought you had answered a lot of this, but if you want to specifically go ahead.
Well, there's two issues I want to make sure I point out. To Ms. Gina Viola and Ms. Paula Miner, I would ask that they have a meeting with Deputy Chief Regina Scott relative to the events that they raised concerns about involving the park incident that was Jesse Owens Park that was referenced in their remarks and I referenced earlier in my remarks. I think that that meeting would prove helpful for all sides to better understand each other's perspectives, and I would very much look forward to that. Secondly, to the other callers' remarks relative to face coverings and the requirement. Forgive me, I should have mentioned this in my remarks. Last Friday, I implemented an order department-wide for all members of the organization to wear face coverings when they're in public in an on-duty capacity. That this is an expectation now, and all employees have been provided that order, as well as my subject of my video. And then lastly, it's been something that as recently as this morning, our morning conference calls, I've asked our command officers to work with their supervisors to monitor compliance. And someone just sent me a couple of pictures of a motor officer wearing it. So I see frequently as I move about the city, officers wearing face coverings, and yet at the same time, I recognize that there are instances in which they're not. My expectation is whenever possible that they wear it unless there's a tactical emergency or something where they must communicate. Lastly, there was a remark about an incident of me, a photograph or imagery of me outside of my residence 9 o'clock at night without wearing face coverings. I apologize for that. I did in the haste of circumstances appearing there, did not don that as I should have, and the public has my apologies for that. And with that, I conclude my remarks.
Thank you. We're moved to public comment now. Please close public comment, Madam Secretary, since everyone's had time to raise their hands. And how many people are in queue now?
We have 7.
7. Can you call the first speaker, please?
The first 3, we have T, Adam Smith, and Zach Sherwin. Go ahead, T.
Yes. So I really hope, all these comments don't go on deaf ears, because week after week, continually, the community is giving you presentation, information, requests and demands from the actual communities that you're in policing, right? But I never see any results of you taking any of our conversation and you're not implementing none of it. It's like the same systemic system or same systemic racism that is found in the inception of this system is a continuation of colonization of 500 years, right? So, and then you have, again, I'm going to say this amazing marketing propaganda machine to get the public, you know, the general public in the media to believe you're doing one thing, but you're actually doing another. You're still further oppressing people, okay? We need this to stop. We need the money that you're taking from the city to go back into the communities. We need less policing in our community. We need services, not more police, right? A racist institution can't help the community. That's all my comments for today.
The next speaker, Adam Smith.
Yes, Chief, when I brought up you coming out and patronizing the people protesting outside of your residence, I understand that, yeah, in 1 second. I understand that it was, I guess I don't understand, but yes, it was late at night and I too would be like, I don't need to put on a mask right now. The thing is, unless that police officer too that was standing by your side lives in your residence and also came out abruptly and actually wasn't called to the side to the scene, which I assume that he was, I don't think your argument really holds up. So you can patronize us and me all you want, but whatever. I happen to be wearing this shirt today that says Eric and Waukesha and John and Jesse and Keisha and Kenny and Keith and Johnny and Caesar and Grishario. And I would just say again, Mr. Bonner, when you said that you inferred that people on the receiving end of police violence and specifically LAPD violence have lost their way, I'm just going to read you some of the people on my shirt. Eric Rivera was 20 when he was walking down Wilmington Boulevard. And when 7 seconds later, he was being shot at and then run over by a police car where the car was left for 12 hours. He didn't lose his way. He was murdered and then run over with an LAPD vehicle. Waukesha Wilson didn't hang herself inside a jail. She didn't lose her way when she was hung and her killer, Officer Bratton, was fired by your police department. John Horton didn't lose his way when he was beat to death by 10 sheriff's deputies in 2009 inside Men's Central Jail. Jesse Romero didn't lose his way when he was shot in the back at 14 years old by Eden Medina. Keisha Michael didn't lose her way when she was asleep in a fucking car in Inglewood and got murdered. Kenny Watkins, when he got shot in the back by your traffic officer, didn't lose his way. He was running away.
Next speaker, please.
Zach Sherwin.
Yes, I accidentally pressed the button to lower my hand back when we were talking about the use of force report. So I'm going to go back to that and make the remarks that I would have made at that time. Everybody from the LAPD during that started going out of their way to emphasize how these are not statistics. These are individual lives. These are real people. Grimala said it, and then Arco said it, and then Moore jumped on the bandwagon. Everybody just conspicuously making this display of really driving that point home. Well, that's not something I've heard in other weeks when Commissioner Decker hasn't gone out of her way to make that point before everybody started talking, and before which comment I didn't hear anyone speaking to that. Despite Chief Grimala's lengthy report with all those statistics in it. And the only reason Commissioner Decker said it is because community members lifted it up last week. So I just want to name that I don't believe a second of everybody sanctimoniously talking about how these are real people behind these numbers, especially because your conduct and your report belies that lip service. You know, reporting changes in numbers that are as small as the absolute numbers in these reports, presenting those as percentages, I think, is really misleading, and it gives a false impression of progress and improvement to be trumpeting these changes in percentage when it's like 1 or 2 actual digits. Also, I want to say, as someone did before, that you list the people killed by cops as suspects in that report. They're not suspects, they're victims of violence by your police department. How dare Chief Arcos use the phrase death by PowerPoint in the use of force report? That juxtaposition was stark and disturbing, and it jumped out at me. Death by PowerPoint. Shame on him, Chief Moore. Tell him not to use that phrase when he's talking about actual death. And Steve Soboroff, how embarrassing for you saying you wanted to give a shout out using that kind of language. Equally pathetic is your conspicuous use of nicknames for LAPD higher ups like B. Gurmala and Bobby Arcos. It'd be funny if the consequences if your fanboyism weren't lethal. Some actual oversight would be refreshing, like lemonade, which in 2019 was named the official drink of the state of Arizona.
Next speaker, please.
Next 3 speakers, Gina Viola, caller ending in 1403, and Melina Abdullah. Gina Viola, please.
I am here. So I want to talk about the day and time of these meetings. We talk about it a lot, but I have to say again, it is imperative that you change the time of these meetings. You specifically have it at the same time as City Council. And right now it's really important that we be able to attend City Council meetings. We need to be able to speak to the mayor and to the City Council, who's about to approve a budget where the LAPD is going to be receiving an increased amount of money, while the rest of the city is getting a decrease. Why are we funding police for a health and an economic crisis? We need to be funding other departments, and the only way to make our voices heard is to be able to be at those meetings. And we can't do that when we have to be at these meetings. Mr. Soboroff talked about congratulating the hundreds and hundreds of community meetings that are had. Where are these hundreds and hundreds of community meetings? They're just not happening. You're not doing them out in the community. Pre-COVID, certainly you can't now, but you could have these meetings in the evenings where I feel you'd have far greater attendance and the city would have a lot more to say. So I really hope that you will consider changing these to an evening meeting. I hope that they will never return to the LAPD headquarters so that more folks have access to them. The last thing I want to speak to is, I know very redundant and you hear every week, but what is going to be done about the officers that executed Grishario Mack? What is going to be done about the officer who executed Albert Ramon Dorsey? Those officers have all been found out of policy, and we continue to ask about it, and you continue not to give us any information about what happens. I will show up week after week, and I will continue to uplift the name Grishario Mack and Albert Ramon Dorsey until we get some justice for those out of policy findings that it took so long to finally get.
Thank you. Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Caller ending in 1403.
Yay! So let's talk about the new doors on the headquarters. I went there yesterday. You got rid of the sliding doors, and now you have these hand-pulled doors, and they're very heavy and difficult to pull. Please return the sliding doors. They were much, much better, especially for public gatherings. And I appreciate also these meetings are taking place a lot faster. This is a very quick meeting today. I appreciate it. 52% of the budget will go to LAPD. According to today's city council meeting, I talked to the city council today, and I got 4 minutes and wasn't cut off at all. I guess my call to the FBI has really, really helped in the last couple of weeks. I want to give a shout out to the FBI agents at the Roy Ball building. Thank you so much for that cup of coffee. Also, Arizona is a wonderful place to go. And I would recommend all officers take your budget, take your pensions, and move to Arizona.
Spindler, you are far afield from anything within the jurisdiction of this board. Either conclude your remarks with something substantive or work all the time.
Oh, okay. Stay on topic. Yes, sir. Stay on topic. Okay, that's my other voice. All right, so everybody's talking about Arizona. I thought I could. Okay. So finally, we thank Judge Carter, I brought him here from Orange County. I'm glad you all met him. Now, get these homeless criminals off the street so they stop setting all these evil fires. Fires are dangerous. And
next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Melina Abdullah.
Hi, I want to uplift. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to uplift that today is the birthday of Minister Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. Today is also the day of power during the holy month of Ramadan. And I also want to acknowledge the work of our elder, Larry Aubrey, who passed on Saturday, who for decades has been trying to hold you and LAPD accountable, who inspired by the murder of Devin Brown, the 13-year-old boy who was killed by an LAPD officer more than 10 years ago, said that we have to do something about police accountability. Unfortunately, the part of the meeting that I've heard does nothing about police accountability. When we think about that 2019 report on the use of force, you know, it's really important that you think about the language that's been used. This idea that when people are killed by police, they're dubbed suspects rather than victims. Thank you, Zach, for bringing that up. That's horrifying that you do that. It's horrifying that you cast Black community members as automatic suspects. You might say that you don't go into communities, that this new pandemic moment hasn't empowered you to go into communities and harass, brutalize, and kill people. But what happened in Jesse Owens Park is a stark reminder of what LAPD does. It's important also to remember that any decline in the killings of our people at the hands of police is in line, can be traced back to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I also want to encourage you, lifting up those names, to think about how you can behave ethically. There's no way LAPD should be gobbling up 54% of the city budget. Give it back.
Thank you. Next speaker.
The final speaker, Hamid Khan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So one of the things that for us who've been here on the front lines in this space for many years, and holding and exposing you and exposing your violence and exposing your corruption, is that our obligation and commitment to think ahead as to what's coming our way as well. And as we looked at this use of force report, what needs to happen, at least maybe Dale Bonner, maybe you have the gumption to go there as well, is to what do we see in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months? We're seeing massive unemployment. We're seeing massive rise in homelessness. We're seeing massive trauma, both emotional and other forms of trauma that our communities are going to be facing. We're seeing unemployment potentially in the high 20s, 26 to 30%. So historically speaking, and this is one of the principles that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition operates by, that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history, is what we have seen, that the failure of this system, this patriarchal, settler colonial, white supremacist system, is that we police our way out of these problems. Now, bring that into the expansion of the surveillance state, bring that into this application of contact tracing, bring that into the expansion of the police force, and then bring that the lethal impact of speculative and hunch-based policing. We're looking at a very morbid future right now. We're looking at a future where what we can expect is more police violence. We can expect, and we see that, not just expect, we see more police violence, we see more police corruption, we see more cover-ups. So I think this is really the time that not just look at the garnishing and the superficial nature of these reports, is to dig deep and to listen to what the community is constantly saying, because this is the time to assess the lethal impact of the programs that are being instituted and that are being operationalized. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on, and I'll close the public comment session for the closed session items. After Mr. Teefank, we had some written comments submitted. I just want to be sure we have a record of those comments.
Yes, Madam President. We received 4 email comments under public comment yesterday afternoon, and they're all the same. I will read one of them. This commission needs to address and implement a change in the enforcement of social distancing and mask wearing ordinances. We have seen time and time again that, much like everything else, there is a clear racial bias in the enforcement of these ordinances. While white folks get a mask or a ticket and are said to be expressing their First Amendment rights, Black and brown people are brutalized, ironically, by officers not wearing masks or gloves, who are not observing 6 feet rules themselves with other officers or the community. This is not only unjust, but unhealthy, as shown in the video of at least 20 officers converging on a group of Black people at Jesse Owens Park this past weekend, resulting in the arrest of 6 people. In a time where individuals need to be released from prison to avoid contraction and further spread of COVID-19, officers are instead putting people in jail for minor, nonviolent offenses and putting them and the community at further risk. People need resources and education. Instead of the police are getting more financial resources and are causing more trauma and harm. Police are not doing this enforcement anyway, as described and detailed in the demands you receive from BMLA in regards to COVID-19. These should be community jobs from trained professionals that give resources and assistance, not tickets and abuse in community. That concludes the remarks.
Thank you. And now we'll close public comment for the closed session. How many people are in queue, if any?
We have 3. We have Melina Abdullah, Hamid Khan, and LG Tribute Dynasty. The first one is Melina Abdullah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know how my hand got raised. Sorry.
That's okay. Next speaker then.
Next speaker is Hamid Khan.
Yeah, likewise. I think it's a technical glitch when you, Ms. Decker, Eileen, you say that, raise your hands and lower your hands. I think that happens like that.
Okay, I apologize. Thank you though for letting me know. I appreciate that. And LG Tribute Dynasty, looks like they took down their hand as well. So apologies if there's any confusion on my part or in the technology. And I'm right, is that correct, Madam Secretary?
Correct, there are no other callers.
Okay, very good. Then we'll go into closed session to handle the closed session items. Madam Secretary?
The Board of Police Commissioners will now recess into closed session to discuss item numbers 4A1 and 4A2 in accordance with Government Code 54957.
Thank you.
Ready?
No, okay. I see all commissioners who were present earlier are present. Mr. Tiefenk, could you do the readout of the closed session?
Yes, Madam President. Commissioners concluded their business in closed session as item 4A1. Carotid Restraint Control Hold 024-19. Commission on a vote of 3-0 adopted the Chief of Police recommendations, which were tactics, administrative disapproval, 1 police officer 3, tactical debrief, 1 police officer 1, non-lethal use of force in policy, 1 police officer 3, 1 police officer 1, lethal use of force out of policy, administrative disapproval, 1 police officer 3. As to lethal use of force, use of lethal force, other, number 029-19, Commission adopted the Chief's recommendations on a 3-0 vote. Those recommendations were tactics, administrative disapproval, 1 police officer 3 and 1 police officer 2, non-lethal use of force in policy, 1 police officer 2, lethal use of force out of policy, administrative disapproval, 1 police officer 3. That concludes the report.
Thank you very much. Next week, we will not be having a meeting because of the Memorial Day holiday. And the only thing left to do is for a motion for adjournment. I will move it forward. Is there a second? Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Bonner. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? No opposition. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.